Good evening. God bless. Welcome back to the Orthodox Ethos podcast. I'm Father Peter Hears, and we're really honored to have a special guest tonight to talk to us about the new release from Come Out and Press on the reception of Heterodox, and that is Father John Whiteford. Stay tuned for a very interesting discussion. Welcome back again. Father John, welcome to the podcast. Really glad to have you on tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
I think it's going to be a great discussion. This is a really important topic as it cuts to the heart of our ecclesiology. In other words, Christ, the body of Christ, what it means to be a Christian, and so many things that has to do with the Orthodox mission today. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the book has been both welcomed and it's been selling amazingly, but also it's been attacked because it cuts to the heart of a lot of issues all at once. So it's really important. And the reason why we offered the book, we worked on it so hard, and three of us authors worked hard to produce it, was precisely because we wanted to offer it to the church. And we saw how important this topic was. It cuts to the heart of the salvation of the faithful and the mission of the church. And so this podcast is a big part of, we hope, what will be the fruit of this book, which will be a heartfelt, brotherly discussion about the contours of conversion, catechism, and then, of course, initiation through the mysteries, and the relationship of the church to the various heterodox confessions that surround the Orthodox Church, especially in the Western world. And to go deeper, because it's a process of learning and going deeper. At least that's how I feel going through this whole process of writing this book, is that it's revelatory for the author. As much like when you go to teach a class, you learn as much or more than the people who are listening to you when you have to confront it and then teach it. So hopefully this will be the beginning of many such discussions. And we're really glad that you're joining us because you've dealt with the topic quite a bit yourself. Would you like, just for those few people who do not know much about yourself, would you like to just say a few words of introduction? That would be much appreciated.
Well, I'm the rector of St. Joan Orthodox Church in Spring, which is just to the north of Houston. And I've written a lot over the years. Most of I've only had one thing published in paper, and that's an essay on Sola Scriptura that was published by Concilia Press, which now is Ancient Faith Press, or Ancient Faith Publications. But that text is out of print, but you can read it online. But when I discovered the wonders of hypertext, I've since had a hard time going back to printed books, because it's so nice to be able to hyperlink things in your text to things that you want people to be able to check.
Indeed. Well, we have
been the editor of the St. Innocent liturgical calendar, and I just mostly finished up 2024. I've got one more person working on it who will probably have their revisions tonight. I'll send it to the publisher, and then I'll be done, but I'm already working on 2025.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I know many people around the world, especially in places where there's not an Orthodox church, really value the liturgical calendar. We reference it in our work with many people coming to Orthodoxy through the internet now all over the world. It's hard for them to get to divine services. So it's really important in the English language. In Greek, there's tons of stuff. In Russian, there's tons of stuff. But in English, a lot of times, there's not a lot that can help the faithful participate. So thank you for that offering.
You're welcome.
So I guess where we could begin the discussion is where a lot of people, I've been observing some of the discussion online since the book's released, and some of the criticism of the book, or the position which we consider to be the patristic consensus and criteria. But it does seem to begin with, or a lot of ink is spent on the person of Saint Cyprian of Carthage. And although maybe our listeners or viewers don't know, but those who have been paying attention to the writings of, important theologians of the 20th century, like Father George Florovsky and others, this has been a discussion going back over 100 years. What about St. Cyprian's position in terms and his place in terms of our ecclesiology, but also St. Augustine and the whole debate between St. Cyprian and St. Stephen is given a lot of ink. And I think I've discovered through the research and writing this book is that maybe we take too much for granted in terms of what we've been dealt with historically and theologically as to the position of Rome. We can talk about that, but and the position of Saint Cyprian. So let's talk about Saint Cyprian's position. I saw in a podcast you did with David. I'm not sure how to say his last name. Erin, is that? I'm not. Maybe I'm
I would
butchering
assume
it.
it's Erhan, but I might be grossly mispronouncing it.
Yeah, that sounds right. And you talked a little bit about Saint Cyprian's position. How should we understand, or how do you think we should understand Saint Cyprian's position in terms of our basic Orthodox ecclesiology, first of all, and then we'll go into the question of economia after that.
Well, a lot of the people who want to say that there are real baptisms outside of the church and that Saint Cyprian's canon doesn't matter will say, well, his canon was overturned by a later council of Carthage, and so therefore it doesn't matter. But the key thing that has to be kept in mind is that council of Saint Cyprian, which only produced one canon, so you can't say that they just overlooked this one canon because that was the only canon. They affirmed that council along with this later council, and along with the canons of Saint Basil the Great. So unless you want to assume that the fathers of the Quinisex Council or Trullo or the Sixth Ecumenical Council, as it's variously referred to, unless you want to assume that they were just schizophrenic and they just didn't realize what they were affirming, you have to assume that they were affirming Saint Cyprian's canon to be true in some sense and still have meaning. And I think the only thing that makes sense is to interpret it in the light of St. Basil's first canon, to say that in principle, what St. Cyprian's canon says is absolutely true, which is that there's no baptism outside of the church. But to also understand that as later councils decided that there can be the reception of the heterodox under some circumstances by economia. And so you have to, I think, see St. Basil's canon as the one that bridges the gap between what you might otherwise think is a contradiction.
Yes, it's well put. I was struck by the when you read St. Cyprian extensively, what you'll see is that he does have something like economia, at least with respect to each bishop being able to govern. He doubles down on that because he's being attacked by the Pope. I think part of the reason why he goes into this is because he's being attacked by the Pope for his position. But he's saying, look, I'm not here to, I'm leaving. Every bishop has his own proper right of judgment. Each prelate has his own administration of the church. He says this repeatedly. And to me, that's a nod to economia, because economia means the management of the house. I mean, so each bishop has the management of his house. And so he's saying that they have to make the judgment. And he also says, for those who've reposed, have gone on to the next life, that God will show mercy if they've been received without proper Orthodox baptism. So I think sometimes we paint a very stark, I've heard this expression, unmitigated darkness exists outside of that's St. Cyprian's position with regard to, it seems to be a real straw man for St. Cyprian, to my mind.
That's a straw man that's often invoked anytime someone's talking about following what the church actually teaches and not viewing heterodox sacraments as having the grace of the sacramental grace of the church. And
right.
That's just not correct. The thing is, I think that it's clear from the canons that we make distinctions between someone who, say, is a Roman Catholic and someone who is a pagan. We understand that there's a distinction there, and certainly the history of our interactions with the various heretical or heterodox groups shows that we make distinctions. And in the various councils and canons that address how we receive different kinds of people, you see them making distinctions even among different heterodox groups as to how they should be received based on how close they are to the church in terms of their faith and also in terms of their practice.
So I think that's something I want to get into a little bit later, but so I don't want to forget that. But the question of the criteria of reception is very important. I don't want to run ahead of it because I think there's, first of all, it's established Orthodox ecclesiology. One of the things I see going on many times, people will look at the practice and then reinterpret or interpret our ecclesiology through our practice, which could be very misleading because there's obviously a variety of practice in different times and places. And so if you start with the practice or you start with the end, let's say, of the history, you're going up. That's how I put it. You're going up backwards. I mean, you got a Christology and then ecclesiology and then pastoral theology, sacramental. That's kind of the order of things, it seems to me. I mean, the day of Pentecost kind of points to that kind of order as well, right? They were all together as the church in the Eucharistic assembly with the common faith, and then the divine, the Holy Spirit descended. So there is, the establishment of the church, and then the life of the church and how it's worked out through the economy of God. So the ecclesiology seems so important. One of the things you just said, which I'd like to touch on more, is, the minute what are the implications when we say that they're in the heterodox rites or ministrations or sacraments, however you want to put it, that there is the divine energies of God, the uncreated divine energies. What are the implications? It seems to be grave implications for our understanding of who Christ is ultimately.
Right, and you can see an example of what you're talking about in the recent decision of the Church of Finland, where they said that they will not receive anybody who is baptized in the name of the Trinity by anything other than chrismation or profession of faith, because they say that the baptisms were effective, or I can't remember the exact wording that they used, but the problem with that is when you ask the question, what does baptism do? Baptism unites you to the church. And so if we believe that heterodox baptism is effective in that sense, then there's no reason to even talk about reception at all. We should just talk about having them go to confession and receiving communion, or maybe chrismating them if they came from a Protestant group that didn't do any kind of confirmation or chrismation. But you wouldn't bother with that at all with, say, a Roman Catholic that had been chrismated. You just say, hey, come on in, have communion with us. Plus,
right.
You'd also have to assume that their Eucharist has the grace of the church if they're already in the church too. And in which case, why don't we, if we're living in an area where there's only a Catholic church nearby and we have to drive 2 hours to come to an Orthodox church, why don't we tell people to go to the Catholic church? Exactly.
Before I go on, my technicians are telling me that your microphone's a bit too low, and some people are having trouble hearing you. Can it be moved closer, or?
Okay. Is that any better?
That seems a little bit better, I think. Huh?
Okay.
Let's see if they agree. Is that better, guys? I think it is. I heard it being slightly better.
Okay.
Mildly better, I'm told. So I don't know if it can be moved closer to you.
Well, let me try something here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Very good. So so that points to the unity of the mysteries, right? And I think of it both practically, historically. When I was doing my PhD thesis on Roman Catholicism and the Vatican II Council and ecclesiology, one of the things that struck me, which points to the unity of mysteries both in time and space, but also theologically, is that they had a dissolution of the unity of mysteries in the Middle Ages. And so they began to talk about being baptized alone. With their chrismation, of course, happened years later. When the bishop would come, they wouldn't allow priests to do the confirmation or chrismation. So then you had a physical, chronological distance between the two mysteries. And then eventually they had, of course, distance between the first communion as well. Or sometimes they would have first communion before confirmation, which seemed a bit strange. And then they would also have first confession sometimes after confirmation, or somehow out of order. I forget exactly how it was. So that seemed to influence also their theology. I mean, that's not just my idea, but that's actually scholars that have dealt with these matters have implied that when they now in the 13th, 14th century, when they're trying to make sense of their own practice, they start to have different ideas about what confirmation is all about in the West. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, we've always had a unity of in the mysteries of initiation. There's not anybody, I don't think, who teaches that somebody should be baptized and then not chrismate. I mean, it's in the service altogether, one service, but also communed immediately, ideally. And then just if you think, so that's just the unity theologically also is witnessed to by the fact that all the divine service, all the mysteries are in the context of the Eucharist. Like literally the baptismal service would happen at the beginning of the first part of the divine liturgy, as would marriage, as does ordination to this day. So our life is different. Our Orthodox life points to these things organically, intuitively, that there's a unity of the mysteries. And so it's shocking, like you say, like when you see the Finland decision, the Church of Finland's decision is shocking because it seems to me to fly in the face of our own experience of the mysteries. Besides the fact that theologically and ecclesiologically, it's indefensible. The minute you say, as St. Nicholas Cavazos says, the church is known in the mysteries, and then you say you cannot be baptized when you're coming from the heterodox, the implication seems that they possess the mysteries, which means they're the church. So now we have a whole different ecclesiology than we had before.
Right.
And so all of this discussion that we're going through in terms of reception, it touches on our ecclesiology. Do you see, as I do, that our practice now that's been going on for decades and decades of receiving by chrismation is now being increasingly interpreted through a different lens, like we saw in Finland, but just even in many other places? Almost like just like in the West, their practice started to kind of affect their vision of their theology. Do you see that maybe our practice of, economia, chrismation, the rule, not an exception, is now influencing our vision of the church?
We certainly hear people talking like that. And without mentioning names, there's a certain blogger who has gone after you more than once. And there was a recording of a conversation they had with someone when he flat out basically said that he didn't think that the Roman Catholics were any different from us. It was, you might pick a Roman Catholic church or you might pick an Orthodox church, depending on how good they were. So he didn't really see a difference between the two. And so I think you certainly do see this having that kind of an effect, which is another reason why I think going back to baptism as the rule and economia as the exception to the rule would make a lot more sense in our time. Besides the fact that one thing that's true, especially since, say, the 50s, is that you're not dealing with the same kind of Roman Catholics or Protestants that you had, back, 100 or 200 years ago. 200 years ago, you could reliably predict that if someone was baptized as an Anglican, that they would have been baptized a certain way. Whereas today, they might have been baptized by a lesbian or a transgender clergyman who baptized them in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer, or the Father, the Mother, and the Child. And unless you had a videotape of the service, the fact that you had a baptismal certificate that said that they were baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit wouldn't necessarily mean anything other than that they haven't modified their paperwork. But doesn't mean that's how they were actually baptized. Right.
So this whole idea that we're even sure of what we're dealing with in heterodoxy, and that we can say carte blanche, these people are received this way, it seems to be called into question today, because there's a million and one things going on even within denominations that have some kind of a statement that this is what we do. That doesn't mean it's going on in most places.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because that's exactly what I remember Metropolitan Heterodox Vlach was saying about 15 years ago. And he said, one more reason besides all the others that are quoted in, St. Nicodemus or the Pedalian or wherever you might go to find out what do we do, is that it is economia is becoming the rule in a context and in a climate where there's no guarantee you even know what's been practiced. So the criteria are entirely out the window. Like it's like we have no criteria for our practice.
And when you're talking about Protestants that don't even believe that baptism does anything other than profess your faith, they're obviously a lot less concerned about the form because they don't really think that it does anything anyway. So
Right.
That's all the more reason why you should be skeptical, that these people were baptized in a way that you just assume. And I think that's also one of the problems when you're talking about people who were raised in the church, is I think a lot of times there's a naivete on the part of priests or bishops, and they just assume that Protestants believe certain kinds of things and that there's some kind of consistency. And I know of, I know of a case, let's just say, I don't want to start calling people out, but I know of a case where a priest married a Orthodox woman to a Mormon and probably got the bishop's blessing for it because he didn't specify who he was talking about. He probably just said to the bishop, this is a Protestant guy. He was baptized in the name of the Trinity. May I have your blessing for them to get married. And only later did someone point out, the Mormons don't believe in the Trinity. He didn't know that. And also, I know of cases where people have been received by chrismation who were baptized in oneness Pentecostal churches where they were baptized in the name of Jesus only. And they don't believe in the Trinity either. And so that's obvious. Those are problematic things that ought not happen.
Yeah, and if we approach the holy mysteries with great fear of God, that we are totally and 100% doing the Lord, what the Lord has commanded, without any kind of, I can't imagine us continuing a practice which could end up with such results like you're talking about. It seems to me that we have to really check ourselves, almost like these things that are going on. The Lord's allowing us to, almost screaming at us, saying, stop and protect the boundaries and the identity of the church in the midst of all this chaos.
Yeah. I know of a really extreme case where it was an OCA priest whose wife was baptized in some sort of a Congregationalist church in the New England that had stopped believing in God probably a couple generations prior to her birth. And they baptized her the same way you'd christen a ship. I baptize you, Crystal, without invoking any deity of any kind. Buddha, Muhammad, nobody. Just I baptize you. And she was received by chrismation in the OCA. And later that priest, when he started digging into the issue, he became very concerned, and I think rightfully so. And he wound up getting into quite a bit of trouble when he did a corrective baptism for his wife. And I think that if there's ever been a case where a corrective baptism was warranted, that would be one.
That's interesting. Now let's talk a little bit about the question of form and how you understand it. In the book we present, we make the case that the patristic consensus is that for economy to be done, let's say with the blessing of God, according to the fathers, following the Holy Fathers, we would need at least the form to have been preserved among the various heretical assemblies. And that this was implied in Canon 7 and is supported by canonical commentaries, Saint Nicodemus and others. Even Bishop Nicodemus Melas seems to support that in some of his commentaries, although he says other things elsewhere, as we point out in the book. But there seems to be a consensus that, and what's the minimum that has to be there for us to do economy, which will not, let's say, the way I put it is overturn or undermine the exactitude, and that would be the threefold immersion. And it seems like in the canons that they don't even envision another kind of baptism. In our historical research, we found that basically the idea that there could be other kinds of baptism, we're talking about according to exactitude. Obviously, we have the emergency situations, and those are spelled out in the canons as well. And those are spelled out in the second and third tier of the Didache and other places. But when we're talking about reception, we're always talking about the ecclesia, right? The exactitude. We're talking about that's the basis upon which we judge whether something is maintaining the apostolic form and the commandments of the Lord. And so, there doesn't seem to be in the canons and the fathers any other vision for baptism besides triple immersion. We have canons, apostolic canons, which explicitly say they must be triply immersed. Otherwise, and if someone does something different or accepts something different, they should be deposed. But then also, we didn't really find anything until the scholastic or post-Latin, post-schism period, where we have a theologian, Aquinas, who goes in great length to discuss why baptism is a washing and not immersion. And therefore, we can accept a sprinkling or a pouring according to exactitude. We can accept those things, and there's no issue at stake for. And that eventually becomes the rule in Catholicism. So, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you also found in your examination of the matter, or do you have some other perspective on it?
Well, I think that when we're talking about a single immersion baptism, I think it's a lot more problematic than a baptism by pouring that's done, by thrice pouring. Because you do have that canon that you were alluding to that says the Eunomians should be received by baptism because they baptize by a single immersion. And so the implication obviously is that baptizing by a single immersion is a problem. But when it comes to baptizing by pouring, it is at least a possible way of baptizing somebody if there was a need to do it. Now, of course, the issue is what do you do in a situation where there wasn't really a need, but it just becomes a bad practice that a group of people continue to do,
which is the case, I think, if we're honest, it's just the case around the Orthodox world. There's much.
Certainly a lot of that, and I've not really studied the history of where this practice sort of became the normative practice in the West. I do know that back when I was a Nazarene, I used to have the complete works of John Wesley, which included his journal. And I remember reading about when he was a missionary in Georgia, and that we're talking about the state of Georgia, not or that time the colony of Georgia, not the republic. But anyway, he got into some hot water because there was a woman that he had his eyes on that wound up marrying somebody else, and then when they had a baby, they wanted the baby baptized by sprinkling or pouring, and he said, well, I'll do that if you are going to write a statement saying that this baby is infirm. And they didn't want to do that, and they thought that he was just being spiteful. But obviously the implication is that the Anglicans were still baptizing infants by immersion, and
yes.
So I'm not sure when that stopped, but we're talking about the 1750s roughly that I think he was in Georgia, maybe a little earlier than that, but not by much. And so when did it become the practice? I'm not really sure. I think in the Orthodox Church, the reason why a lot of priests don't baptize babies by triple immersion properly is because, I think any new priest is apprehensive the first time you baptize an infant, because the last thing you want to do is have a baby that winds up choking on the water or is injured in any way. And I've seen over the years priests try all kinds of different techniques where they'll say, hold the baby on your forearm while you're pinching the nose, and then you scoop the baby, but an older priest in Roquefort told me, all you got to do is just grab the baby under both armpits and baptize them, and they have a natural reflex that will keep them from inhaling while you're doing that. And I tried it and found it to work, and I've never had any problem. And I think maybe if we could just educate more priests, they would be less apprehensive. But I think that that's at least part of the motivation for this practice, is that priests are just afraid to do it properly because they don't know better.
I think that we can make a distinction, which you're making implicitly, between a systematic, intentional departure / total indifference and somehow justification for a practice, which would be problematic according to the canons and the fathers. And another thing for someone to say out of weakness or out of fear, which, of course, is not praiseworthy, but it's human and it's understandable. And it's not a stance of necessarily of impiety or rejection or rebellion, but more of, not having been properly trained, or perhaps, or not having the spiritual wherewithal to do it, which needs to be corrected. That's something different. But I do feel, having lived in Greece for 20 years and traveled in the Balkans to Serbia and other places, what struck me was how widespread the departure is from triple immersion, even with adults. And I'll tell you a story which is indicative. I have several of these, but I'll tell you just the one which is the most shocking. And I don't say this to criticize anyone. I really, with all, it's just like, when two doctors get together, they talk about the various diseases, or they talk about the various struggles of their patients. I mean, it's in the realm of pain of heart for the sake of the church and the full, initiation of the people of God into the mystery of the incarnation. But I was at the feast of I won't even say the name of the monastery, but it's a very, very prominent monastery in Serbia. And there were a number of hierarchs there, including hierarchs that I revered for their confession of faith. And I was coming down the mountain to the place where it was somewhat of a mountain where the monastery was. And I was coming down to where they had the reception. And the bishops were on my right under some kind of kiosk. And on my left was a priest around a tree, fully clothed, baptizing adults with water over the forehead. And I'll never forget. I mean, I just was blown away that practice, which was clearly a Western Latin practice that had become very well known. That's when you see somebody pouring a little water over the forehead, you think of the Pope in the Sistine Chapel or something. You don't think of an Orthodox baptism. So, but that had been obviously consciously accepted among many, including faithful hierarchs and priests, as somehow normal. And since then, I've had many discussions with other clergy, not just in Serbia, but in Bulgaria and other places. And they say, yeah, this is what we've been doing for as long as we can remember. In other places, they put water in a little bowl and they pour it over the head of the person. And I asked someone, well, why do you do that? And they said, well, we don't. Nobody's ever questioned it, but I guess it's because we don't have a baptistry, or we don't go down to the river. So it's almost like they're not conscious of the problem. It's almost like it just exists and no one questions it. But when you sit down, and not without judging anyone, but when you sit down and you say, is this warranted? Is this called for? Is it justified? Is it blessed? Is it praised in the fathers, in the canons? You cannot justify it. So there needs to be some kind of corrective to these practices. So I wonder if the general malaise is not related to the general departure from these from the proper, not just proper in the sense of some legalistic thing, but that we are being obedient to what the Lord and the fathers have handed down to us. You might say, well, maybe not the result, but it could be the cause, right? So secularization causes this. Now, what is the result? That's a bit, you have to speculate. I'm not a charismatic elder to tell you that I have some kind of insight into the spiritual consequences, but there certainly seems to be no way to justify it, at least as a practice.
Well, I know in Russia, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it was fairly common to baptize people this way. And I think part of it was because so few churches had an adult baptistry. But one thing I've noticed, certainly the last time that I was there, was that any new church that I went to had a very large adult baptistry. And so it is a problem that they're addressing. And of course, there's other ways to deal with it. Like I think what most parishes in the United States do that don't have a church that, Father Josiah Trenum's beautiful church, where he has a beautiful baptistry. What most of us do is we get a horse trough at the local, farm store, and we use that. And so I would imagine they have those things in Russia too. And I think people just need to start pressing this question. And one of the things that I think is good about pressing this question is I think a lot of people, they just assume, well, it's been done. It's okay. It's an acceptable way. And so when someone starts asking the questions, is this really correct? I think it hopefully causes people to start questioning whether they should continue to do this. And I think that, it's one thing to do that because you have an exceptional circumstance or whatever. It's another thing to do that just because, well, we've always done it that way, and not even bother to question whether that's really what you should continue to do.
Right. So hopefully this book will also work in that direction. It'll get people to think and go deeper. Do you feel like the book did that for you, or how was when you read the book, what was your impression? I know you wrote a review on it, but maybe you want to elaborate a little bit.
Well, I was pretty much in agreement with the thesis that baptism by full triple immersion should be the norm before I read the book. I was impressed by how thorough the documentation of the book was, because I actually thought there was a little bit more variation over time than the book presented. And I was a little bit surprised at certain individuals in church history, the things that they said, just because I wasn't aware of it. But
anybody come to mind? Anybody come to mind that made an impression?
Well, for example, Saint Luke the surgeon, being part of the Russian church, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution through World War II and thereafter, the standard of the Russian church would, I would think, not have encouraged him to have taken the stand that he did. But from reading the book, he first instructed his priests to stop baptizing babies by just pouring water over their head. And then after they continued to disregard what he said, he then said, okay, now you're gonna have to redo these baptisms because I done told you to stop it and you didn't. And so I think he was using his power as a bishop to bind and to loose. And I think the main reason why he did that was one way to cure a priest of continuing that practice, because no priest would want to have to go back to people and say, oops, the bishop said I have to redo this because I did it wrong. And so I imagine that was probably an effective didactic tool. I
was impressed that he said 6 months suspension with priests who are do not correct their disobedience, which was
I'd forgotten about that, but that struck me too, because I would think that during the Soviet period he could have easily said, well, you know what, we have so few priests that are able to serve, why would we want to deprive the faithful of the opportunity to receive the mysteries, and that's a pretty lengthy suspension. But I think his hope was that we won't have to repeat it twice.
Right. So that was extremely impressive. Those are the kind of things we found in our research. I didn't know about that either, and that were both encouraging, but also kind of eye-opening when you have these, exceptionally bold confessors of the faith. He lived that. He lived that desire to be totally and 100% obedient to Christ, and it's very inspiring for us today. In spite of the malaise that we see around us, or the encroaching or rather galloping ecumenism that we're surrounded by today, moving toward the opposite direction from the akrivia, the exactitude. St. Luke, I mean, he's in the middle of this terrible situation. The church is dwindling. It's in the persecution. There's people who are being martyred and exiled, and yet he still is mindful enough to say, no, absolutely, we're not going to depart on something which I think probably no one would even have brought it up to him, right? Nobody would have said, Bishop Luke, what are you doing? You need to baptize by 3 immersion. Probably very few people would have said anything, and yet his conscience demanded him to follow that. I wonder if he had been reading St. Hilarion Trotsky or other patristic-minded scholars and Russian saints to have come to that conclusion. Yeah, so it's not impossible for us then. We're here in freedom. We don't have a Soviet, at least not yet, we don't have a Soviet Union kind of authoritarianism over our head. there's no reason why we can't do a proper triple immersion.
Right. And I think that it certainly is an issue that needs to be pressed, that people take these things seriously, because it's easy to be lazy about stuff, but there are some things that we ought to be very careful about, and how we receive people is one of those things. I think it's something that should never be taken lightly, just like serving the liturgy. If you don't take it seriously, it's a great sin for a priest to do that. And that's also where you get into things like liturgical accidents, because you're not taking it seriously. You should approach the Eucharist with at least as much fear and trepidation as you would using heavy machinery that
Right.
might wind up harming you in some way if you're not careful about how you use it. And
Yeah, maybe.
baptisms are important.
Yeah, maybe one way we need to help people get a perspective on the question of form, because a lot of times people will say that's just legalism. That doesn't matter. God doesn't care. Water's the important part. What's the deal? Why does it need to be a triple immersion? Of course, the theology points and symbolism points entirely to triple immersion. And God, and the fathers clearly have said that this is what is meant by go ye into the world and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There's never really been any question as far as the Orthodox are concerned that that's what we mean by baptism. But maybe one way to help people to get beyond that is to say, well, what would you say to a priest who came out and showed up on Sunday after Sunday, and when it's time to do divine liturgy, he didn't use bread and wine, but he used, whatever was available, or he used crackers and grape juice. And because it's not too much different to say that which the canons call out is integral to the mystery, expressing the mystery. Even Roman Catholic scholars, I was impressed when I was doing my thesis. They say as much. They say, look, yeah, we do these other forms, but the theology is expressed in triple immersion. So nobody doubts that that's the way the theology is expressed. But if we go to a divine Eucharist and we start playing with it, people are going to, I would assume and hope, they would immediately protest. But for some reason, we've accepted this idea that as a norm, not at the exception, but as the norm, we can depart from triple immersion, and there's no consequences.
Well, I think when it comes to infant baptism, there might be some complicity on the part of the laity, because I know people are not used to seeing a baby baptized properly. You get people freaking out.
Sure.
And I've even seen Orthodox people freak out because they obviously came from churches where they didn't do it the way that it's supposed to be done. And so I could imagine that you probably have priests that would get a hard time from people, at least initially. But, once you've seen some, several babies baptized properly, and you realize that they survive, they're not coming up spluttering water all over the place, you'd start to realize, hey, I guess it's not going to hurt them any.
Well, there's definitely a learning curve. There's definitely a pastoral aspect, no doubt about it. And there's a ton. We're actually thinking about doing a website called How to Baptize, which would just be entirely devoted to helping the priest with patristic commentary, even videos, because it's one thing to say, look, that's what you got to do. It's another thing you have to actually make it happen and help people. I don't know. I haven't been to a seminary in the United States, but I taught at Holy Trinity, of course, but I haven't gone to the seminary as a student. And I don't know how much they're actually getting taught that as something that they must really be determined to do. My guess is they're probably not. If they're coming out, we just hear stories all the time, because people end up at our Orthodox ethos, because we talk about this so much. They end up coming to us and saying, a variety of stories, from crazy to mundane. But what's consistent is that there's a lot of ignorance about these matters, and they're good people, but they're just not maybe formed or taught. I don't know. Maybe you know more about the norm in seminaries in the United States, or what it is that they're not prepared to do the baptism properly. It's somewhat of a mystery to me.
Yeah, no pun intended. Apart from Jordanville, I wouldn't really be that familiar with how they might go about it, but you would think that this would be something that would be covered. If you do your website, one thing that would be good to talk about is, what do you do if you don't have a proper font? And just talk about some of the practical things. It's really not that difficult to deal with this problem, but if you've never been told, you might not think that that's something that you could do.
Right. shall we talk about some of the criticisms that you're hearing or that we've seen and try to answer them, or should we go toward I don't know, more pastoral aspects? What would you like to do before we go to questions, which we're getting a bunch of questions in, but we'll have time for those. Anything you prefer you want to address before we go to questions?
Well, I've not been paying as much attention to the criticisms probably as you have, so maybe you can talk about some that I've not seen, but I have seen people kind of nitpick at the book and say, well, look, this picture wasn't the person that was labeled or something like that. And I think that that's not really a substantive criticism. And if somebody wants to take apart the book and show that it's not really representing the history properly, I would love to read a well-done book that takes the book that you produce seriously. But I think that the case that it makes in terms of how people ought to be received and ought to be baptized in a very compelling way. So,
and then the way I say, I think you're right about that. We've seen some criticisms of the date, not really substantive. Mostly they're in the category, if not ad hominem, at least nitpicking, like you said. So let me just quickly throw a couple of those, away because they're not hard to address. But I do want to get to more substantive criticisms, which would be, well, first of all, the question of authorship. We intentionally did not put we meaning the three authors who are on the Orthodox Ethos staff, let's say, and we collectively worked on this for a long time. But we intentionally did not put names underneath it because, and it's been proven true in the first 3 weeks or first week really of this publication, is that we wanted to avoid the ad hominem and the nitpicking as much as possible about our persons or the persons of authorship. And we were actually advised by a bishop who's very supportive of the work, Bishop Luke, who came out, and endorsed the book. He said, don't put your names on it. Let the fathers speak for themselves. Let the fathers speak for themselves. And that's why we did that. Now, some people say, well, this is anonymous. It's actually not anonymous. We say Orthodox Ethos Publication, and then we give a link to the website to see who the people are on staff. So we tried to walk the royal path on that, but inevitably, there's some people who just want to criticize, I think, and so they made that an issue. The second thing was those kind of things that you said, where there's some errors in attributing in particular icons, or we didn't use the term saint for Peter Mogila, which has been a real, for some people on Twitter, it's been a real tragedy. But we didn't take a stance either way. We weren't saying that we doubt the Ukrainian church's decision. We were just recognizing the reality that, at least in most of the Greek world, he's not really referred to as a saint. And the scholars that referred to him that we're quoting weren't quoting him or referring to him as a saint. So, but it's neither here nor there. Somebody pointed out something really good. It said, okay, if we put saint before it, doesn't make him inerrant, doesn't make him infallible, which seems to be, I think people who want to embrace some of his views, they think that maybe that's going to be the case. Somehow the church is giving a seal of approval on everything he wrote, which I don't think is implied with glorification.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
so I don't know.
One of the other criticisms that I've seen is, and it's not entirely the fault of the publishers, because it's what people are doing with it, but people have been taking quotes from the book and throwing them out there for people who haven't read the book, and then a lot of people have been troubled by it. And so that's an issue that I'm not saying that it's your fault or anything like that, but it's a concern I have, just because I have people that I've dealt with over the years where this kind of stuff has caused problems. And I don't want people to be doubting whether they're really Orthodox or not, because they obeyed the priest who was obeying the bishop when they were received.
Sure. Yeah, I think that maybe you're referring to St. Cosmas at Delos, maybe.
That was one of the big ones in my review. That was I reproduced the meme that had been circulating around, and I mentioned a guy I have been corresponding with, who's he's a convert from Islam, and he was baptized in a monastery in the Balkans, and they'd used a tub and they poured 3 buckets of water over him. And the thing is it obviously is not his fault that that's how he was received.
Yes,
And maybe the monks did that because they just didn't have an adult font. It was wintertime, it'd be too cold to take him down to the river, and they saw that as a reasonable application of economia. But I think if it wasn't a reasonable application of economia, I would say that the people who made the choice would be the ones that are going to have to answer for that, rather than for this young man.
Yeah, I think that it's important to stress that whatever people are who are being received improperly or not justifiably, there's economy applied to them, that they're not certainly at fault, or there's some kind of guilt on their part. That seems pretty obvious obviously, and they're Orthodox Christians. Somebody said to us, Father Peter, do you believe people do? Well, that would be absurd. That's not at stake. I mean, people make these kind of logical implications. I don't know where they somehow think there's implications that aren't there. Not in my mind. But I at the same time, I have a question, and it's not mine only. It's people like some of the Athenites or recent saints or Elder Ephraim or others who were quite strident in seeing that people be baptized. And I wonder if and I don't necessarily have the answer, because I don't know if there is an answer the church has provided, so I'm not going to presume I know the answer. But when someone's improperly received, let's say there was no basis for economy and they were received by chrismation, that's an error committed by whoever's committing it, the priest or bishop. But what is spiritually, what is the implication? There's some who hold that there are consequences, and I think that they're trying to drive home the need for us to be obedient to Christ, to the gospel, and that obedience brings forth fruit. And the therapeutic program of the church is being thoroughly applied, like the medicine's being given. Now, ultimately, obviously, God alone will judge. I don't even get into the question of judgment or who's wrong. I just wonder what happens when you don't give the medicine. Is there going to be a spiritual consequence? And do we have a conclusive patristic witness to that? I don't know. I'm not ready to answer the question, but I think it's a question that we haven't really addressed thoroughly.
Well, I think that one question one can reasonably ask is, why not just do it right in the first place? And when you ask Absolutely. That question, I would say, well, that's exactly what ought to happen.
Yes.
But when you're talking about what do you do after somebody's been received that way, the stance of the Russian Church abroad has always been that it's not necessary to do a corrective baptism unless you're talking about an extreme case like some of the ones I mentioned, where they were christened like a ship.
I'm not so much the question of corrective baptism. I'm just questioning, are there consequences? And if there are, what are they?
I don't think that there are consequences for the person that's being obedient and doing what they're told. I talked to a man on Sunday about this, and he came from a Roman Catholic background. When he was received, I believe it was in the Greek Archdiocese, he wanted to be baptized. They told him that he needed to be received by chrismation. That was how they did it. And his attitude was, well, I'm just somebody who wants to be received by the church. I'm going to be obedient and do what I'm told. And I think God honors that in a case like that. And to obey is better than sacrifice, as the prophet Samuel told Saul. And so obedience counts for something. But I do think, my experience has been, I've never seen a single person who was received by baptism that ever came back to me later and said, you know what, I really regretted being received by baptism. But over the years, I've had a number of people who've been received by economia in other jurisdictions, and then later came to me and they were really struggling with this because, they come across things that are said online and causes them to question whether they should have been received that way. And, and it's obviously a problem for them. And So in the Russian Church abroad, the bishops will allow a corrective baptism under some circumstances, and more often than not, when they do allow it, it's been because the person is so troubled by it that they're trying to do this as a pastoral means of soothing their concerns and getting them to get past this problem.
I know Bishop Luke does corrective baptism. He said as much at our conference, which we had in last year. And I'm not sure, I've never really discussed with him if it's just on the question of each person's subjective psychological state, or if he's actually looking at the question of presuppositions being met or not met. I have never had that conversation with him, so that would be an interesting conversation. But I think that that's a part two. I mean, we didn't address this intentionally in the book, although we had a chapter initially in here which touched on the day after, what happens now that if we understand that actually this practice that's pretty widespread today is not the patristic consensus, what do we do? We avoided that intentionally because it's a different topic, actually. It's a different discussion. And we're not there. We're not anywhere near having that discussion, it seems to me. We can't even get a consensus on the first part, what's the patristic consensus. That needs to happen. And there needs to be a third discussion of that. And hopefully that there, we talked earlier about the criticisms of the book, and a lot of it so far has been nitpicking and ad hominem. Hopefully we'll get past that. I look forward to those criticisms that are seriously waged on the basis of the patristic consensus. One of the things that's been brought up that is a little serious, I think we've answered it, was the question of our treatment of St. Jerome. I don't know if you remember that. If you remember that in the book.
I don't remember specifically, no.
Yes, so we presented, I can't get into it all in detail now, but if you go back to that section, it's very interesting. Generally, people in the West have always read that St. Jerome was critical and rejected St. Cyprian and embraced this idea that is more or less, Council of Arles, St. Augustine. We actually presented his views and showed that he seemed to be referring to Cyprian's council, where he has the canon in a positive light, and so people have said, well, that's you're totally off on that topic. You're misleading, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting is somebody wrote today in the chat that that actually Saint Jerome not only, confirming what we just said, but also he witnesses to another person that's supposedly marshaled against St. Cyprian's position, which is St. Dionysius of Alexandria. But there is a in St. Jerome's text, De Viris Illustribus, if I'm saying that, forgive me, butchering it, on illustrious men, he says, quote, consenting to the doctrine of Cyprian and the African Synod on the rebaptism of heretics, he sent many letters to different people which are yet extant in existence. So we have a witness of St. Jerome that St. Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, actually is favorable. We also present other evidence that he was favorable to his letters to the successors of Pope Stephen, and that the successors of Pope Stephen in Rome didn't follow Pope Stephen. So there's a lot of little interesting historical tidbits, which I don't know. I don't want to be so bold that this book is so unique, but at least for me, as one of the researchers, a lot of this was new to me, and I hadn't heard it even commemorated. And so I'm looking forward to seeing Orthodox critique of this. I hope it won't be the typical Latin Western critique of it, and ignoring what St. Jerome said about St. Dionysius, or ignoring that the successors of Pope Stephen didn't follow Pope Stephen, or ignoring that the church, truly did embrace St. Cyprian and Trullo and the Seventh Ecumenical, and then we can get beyond those, which are, I don't think they're Orthodox points. I don't think they're actually coming from within the Orthodox Church. I think we're being affected by the Western view of things, and we get on beyond that, put it aside, and come to a consensus on the patristic, core and criteria. And then we can move on to the question of proper economia, And then we can actually start resisting this total dissolution of our ecclesiology, which you see in the Finnish decision, or we might add, Father, unfortunately, that same stance that the Finnish church took has been taken by the Ecumenical Patriarchate again and again and again. It's not unique to Finland. So yeah, that's just some thoughts. I don't know, throwing it out there, whatever you like, add to it. And we can move on to other aspects.
Quickly, one thing I'd add, which the book also points out, is just that when you look at the Western Fathers that argued that you should not baptize people who are coming from heterodox confessions, at least ones that baptize properly, they nevertheless consistently affirmed that those baptisms didn't have sacramental grace. They basically say that it's only when they're received into the church that those baptisms then have the meaning that's attached with the form. And
such as Pope Leo and St. Gregory the Great, both of them say that exact same thing.
And St. Augustine, he used the analogy of the military mark, as it's in the translation of the Shaft edition of the Fathers, which was a tattoo Roman soldiers were given. And he said that you can have the tattoo illicitly one of two ways. You could either be a deserter, which would be a schismatic, or you could have gone to the local tattoo shop and said, hey, give me one of those tattoos. I think that's pretty cool. And his point was, in either case, those tattoos don't have the meaning that the tattoo is supposed to have, because they're not in the army. It's only when they go back to the army, in the case of the schismatic, or when they join the army, if they did, that tattoo would then have the meaning that was associated with it. But there's no suggestion that just having the tattoo made you a soldier in any sense. And so being baptized outside of the church does not make you a member of the church at all. And whether is it totally meaningless, if you're baptized outside the church is another question, but it doesn't have the sacramental grace of the church, because if it did, you'd be united to the church and you wouldn't need to be received.
Right. There are saints in the last couple of years who will say pretty much that, like Saint Seraphim of Sophia, but they double down exactly on the point that those same saints do, and that is that, the form's there, but the spirit is not there. The spirit is not given.
Right.
Saint Augustine says that repeatedly. He has his own theories about what exactly is happening, which I think are unique to him. Which brings me to another point in question, is that people often say, well, you ignore Saint Augustine and his theology, you ignore his influence in the West, you ignore him as if he's not a part of the church. But in our research, we didn't see his theology and his writings on this topic commemorated in the ecumenical councils. We didn't see it even translated. I'm not even sure if it was translated until much later, maybe in the 13th, 14th century, those works were translated. I'm not sure when they were translated, but they're not commemorated as being read. And what's really interesting is Trullo was rejected in the West initially. And so they didn't have representatives from the West. They didn't, the entire of Trullo was carried out in Greek, of course. There's no reason to believe that they were reading Augustinian works in Trullo, and therefore they were following the theology of Augustine, which, again, on key ecclesiological points, as you point out, it's the same. But in terms of trying to understand our application of economy, he does differ, right? He does differ from, for instance, St. Basil the Great in his 47th canon. The other thing that is interesting is that St. Augustine recognizes the baptism of certain heretics that the Trullo in 95 does not, like the Marcionites, the Valentinians. So they don't seem to be following him on that either. So I don't know if that's in agreement with what you're seeing, but without trying to just throw him off under the bus at all, we also have to recognize the limitations of his influence on the ecumenical councils and that topic.
Right, and I've run across people who try to say, why should we take St. Basil's opinion over someone like St. Augustine? Well, the answer to that question is that St. Basil's canons were affirmed by the ecumenical councils, and St. Augustine doesn't have a single canon in the ecumenical councils. Doesn't mean that St. Augustine's worthless. I often find he has insightful comments on Scripture.
Sure. Of course.
But it does mean that when it comes to canonical matters, you have to give St. Basil a lot more weight because he's got 92 canons and St. Augustine has 0.
Right. Exactly. Thank you. That's a point I've been trying to make forever. I really appreciate that. It's good to hear somebody else say that. It's beautiful. And we love St. Augustine for what he's offered, but he's not the father on this topic, right? As I say to other people, somebody was saying to me earlier, if you have this position, then you're going to throw under the bus this saint or that saint or this person. You're going to imply that he's not, he's not God inspired. I said, none of that's implied. The church has, we go to certain saints for certain things, and the church rallies around that and in councils and otherwise and says this saint expresses the faith. St. Athanasius on the Incarnation, or St. Maximus on the two natures or the two wills. And so on and so forth. There, St. John Damascene on the icons or whatever. We don't say that because other saints did or did not comment on them, or they maybe even got it wrong. That means we're throwing them under the bus, we're ignoring them, or they're not saints, or they're not God inspired. I think the church finds a voice and says, "This is it. This expresses us sometimes," and we pay more attention to those saints on those topics. They become more authoritative for us. You agree with that?
Right.
Yeah. You can see that on all kinds of topics throughout church history.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to ask you, as someone who's from the Russian church, what did you think of the topic of the chapter we did on the 1666, 1667 council? Do you remember that? And
I can't remember the specifics of it well enough to reference what was said, but I know that it's often referred to as a pan-Orthodox council, but I would say it's the most overturned pan-Orthodox council in the history of the church, if you're going to call it a pan-Orthodox council, because this council anathematized anyone who made the sign of the cross with 2 fingers like the old believers did, which basically means that they anathematized all the Russians of every generation prior to that council. And it led to the old believer schism, which separately both the Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian Church abroad later wrote apologies to the old believers about how they were treated. And also the Russian Church before the revolution began to allow the old rite to be used contrary to that council's decisions. And so you have the old believer in Russian is staroveri, and but the Russian Church established the Edinovertsi Church, which is the one faith rather than the old faith. So these were people who used the old rite, but were united to the church, and so that's obviously a good move, and it's not entirely brought all the old believers back into communion with the rest of the church, but it's at least a step in the right direction.
Right. Absolutely. So that does undermine the authority of the council. I think that we commemorate in the book a decision in 1970s from the Moscow Patriarchate, which pretty much disregards the council. Was that too strong of a word? I don't remember.
I don't remember seeing anything where they basically blew off the council entirely, but if they did, I think that would be probably a good thing. Yeah. I can't think of very many things that council said that were, unambiguously true.
What shocked us in our research was the council was run by the Patriarch of Antioch, who has been shown through mainstream scholars like Callistos Ware and others to have been a secret union and to have pledged, a lot to the Pope. And so there's contemporary, there's in the 20th century, we have saints like St. Andrew of Ufa who totally rejected the council, and partly because of the leadership. I mean, if I understand my history correctly, Patriarch Nikon was already gone, and so they didn't have someone to chair, and he chaired it from Antioch. But there were himself and others who were representing the patriarchates, who were, this was a time period where they were under the Ottomans, and there was a lot of pressure from the Jesuits and others to go along with the West, and there was promises, and there was all kinds of machinations going on behind the scenes. And so it seems that on our topic of reception, course, they did a total about face for 550 years before them. They had been baptizing, and Patriarch Philaret, for instance, in 1620, doubles down on that, the disciple of St. Hermogenes, and doubles down on that and says, this is the practice and we will not change. And then 40 years later, they do a total 180. And it's under the influence, I think, of these secret unions and their desire to have reconciliation with Rome. I found that unbelievably enlightening and unbelievable historically, that there's not been much made of that.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the fact that the Patriarch of Antioch was a secret union. Was he the one that actually announced that he was in union with Rome at a certain point, or was he just in secret union and that was something that never came to light during his lifetime?
At the time, I mean, the stuff's come out. I don't know if it was during his lifetime there was a lot, but the stuff that's come out from the scholars shows that he was in. There's a lot of correspondence with him and the Pope, and I'm trying to find right now the actual excerpt here from the book where we, you know, it talks about his role. Should have had it already before we went live, but it is shocking. It is shocking to read just how committed he was to the papacy. Yeah, which maybe one of my coworkers can actually send it to me. I don't, for some reason, I'm just missing it here.
One thing that's interesting that I remember reading from the book by Paul Meindorf, Russia,
yes.
Ritual and Reform.
Yeah, we quote that.
Where he was pointing out that the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time was basically telling Patriarch Nikon to tone it down, and, you know, that there are differences in practice in the church, and this is not something to divide over. And it's just too bad that Patriarch Nikon didn't take his advice, because it would have saved the Russian church a schism, which as it lasted to this day, and you know, severely weakened the church.
Indeed. Now, I've found it here. And there's multiple problems with it. For instance, the reference he makes to St. Mark of Ephesus, and in his encyclical to the all Orthodox Christians of the mainland and the islands, he misunderstands or he misquotes. So, you know, he doesn't say anywhere. St. Mark doesn't say anywhere in the encyclical words, which is implied in the words of the Metropolitan. That it was forbidden to baptize Latins, or the Latins must not be rebaptized. That was what St. Mark was represented as having this position. He simply said it is necessary to anoint with chrism because they're heretics, which is a very different stance, right? That can be understood as economy, because St. Mark, people often don't know or ignore this fact that he was under the impression, even though we know that wasn't a universal practice in the West, but he was under the impression that they were still baptizing. And he was, during the Council of Florence, he actually questioned this and was told by one of his own that no, they're still baptizing, one of those who were supporting the union. So his position would have been very consistent with what the church had done according to economy. And St. Nicodemus explains and says, well, at the time the church was, and the empire was in a very vulnerable position. St. Mark was in a vulnerable position himself. And so economy would be understood given that they had retained the form. So they misrepresent St. Mark to push their case during the council in 1666. And so I don't want to just start reading from the book, but I really
I'll go back and reread that to see if I can find the reference about him being a secret union, because that's a factor I wasn't aware of. Yeah, it's fat. I bet somebody here will send it to me. Let's see. We got something here. I can't find it. Stephen Runciman says, Macarius III of Antioch, who reigned from 1647 to 1672, not only sent his secret submission to Rome in 1662, but also publicly toasted the Pope as his Holy Father at a dinner at the French consulate at Damascus later that year. Wow. So that was 4 years before the council, and he's submitting himself to Rome, according to Stephen Runciman. That's pretty huge. I mean, the Russian church pretty much took the position from that point forward with regard to reception that was laid down by Macarius, and he was a secret union.
I think that's pretty important. I don't know how many people realize that. I didn't realize that for the longest time. And, and that it puts it in a totally different light, the rest of the history of the Russian church with regard to reception, like how it started. And then there was also another influential figure at the council, Metropolitan Paisios Ligariades and Bishop Simeon of Polotsk. I'm saying it wrong. Father George Florowski says this about Paisios. He was a brilliant but deceptive scholar and an absolutely shameless opportunist. Educated at Rome and ordained a uniate prelate, he traveled throughout the Orthodox East, diving into any situation where an opportunity for riches presented itself, and held various positions in the Orthodox Church, such as Metropolitan of Gaza, while receiving regular missionary stipends from Rome. So he's literally getting money from Rome. He was made a uniate. He becomes this metropolitan of the Orthodox Church of Gaza. I think he's at this point he's in the Orthodox Church, yet he's getting money from Rome. He played a major role in the history of the Russian Church. This is Florowski talking. Of the time, first ingratiating himself with Nikon and then becoming the chief spokesman for his opponents and the orchestrator of the Council of 1666. Before the Great Council of 1666, Ligarides had produced forged documents which named him the Patriarch of Constantinople's legate for the council. Tsar Alexei sent a special envoy to Dionysius to find out the truth of the matter, but because Ligarides' fall would be too harmful to Nikon's opponents and personally embarrassing to the Tsar, Dionysius' reply was kept secret and Ligarides continued to function. He's the orchestrator of the council. He was ordained in Rome. This is, now we're quoting elsewhere, Florowski. Goes on. It's really fascinating. I mean, Makarios and Paisios, Ligarides, they had adopted the Latin practices of selling indulgences for the remission of sins. I mean, it's just, you can't write this history. It's like a movie. And then it's regarding Bishop Simeon of Polotsk, his close association with Paisios and his role in the council, it's said, again by Florowski, he was entrusted with the arrangement of the agenda for the councils and instructed to translate Paisios' polemical texts. And his approach to theology, this is how he approached theology, Bishop Simeon, who was instrumental in the council. In preparing his own textbook, Simeon relied on Latin works. He developed only knowledge of Latin and obviously knew no Greek. Unable to read Greek books, he only read Latin ones and believed only Latin innovations and thought to be correct. His work was always guided by Latin and Polish books, that is, by the thoughts of men like Scotus, Aquinas, and Anselm. That's again Florowski. So I don't know, maybe this is pretty, I mean, Florowski, right? This is old news, but for me it was new. And it's pretty important if we're in this whole formation of what we consider to be not just the Russian position. I don't think that it's that small. I think it's actually wider. Those are pretty important historical events that just get swept under the rug.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, that council has a lot of problems, and so I think it should always have an asterisk next to it when it's referenced.
Yeah. Very good. Well, let's open it up to questions. There's a lot of questions. We could go on. The book's 450 pages, 700 footnotes. So literally we could talk for hours and hours about all the ins and outs. But let's go on and let's get some questions. Do we have, let me see, the questions are let me ask my team, is the questions are all in the chat here? Do I need to go anywhere else for the questions? Let me know, Justin or Jason or anybody. It's all in the chat. Okay. Before I go on, the one last quote from Makarios, which I didn't see here, they gave me, which is really amazing. He says, you have observed, this is Patriarch Makarios of Antioch, you have observed that the Roman Church is mother of all the faithful, that it loves the children of the Greeks, for whom it has built a college, and that it loves the Christians of the East, for whom it always cared for sending priests to enlighten them and instruct them. He's writing to the Pope. We understand that, my brothers, for this reason, we implore our Creator and our Lord Jesus Christ, the head of the Holy Church, that he strengthen the Roman Church, elevate its grandeur, consolidate it, and more. And then it goes on. So he's clearly not someone that should have been running that council. Yeah, that was a mistake. All right. So Thomas Rowland, Catholic theology has the concept of baptism by desire. One can be saved if they desired baptism before a faithful death. Does Orthodoxy have a similar theology?
I would say no, but we do have the understanding that if somebody is martyred for the faith, even though they've not been baptized, that is a baptism in blood, and so we have martyrs that were never given baptism in water that are nevertheless martyrs of the church.
Right. So we do not have any kind of analogous doctrine or teaching with regard to desire.
Right. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're saying that somebody goes to hell when they had the desire to be baptized and they died before they were able to fulfill it. That's just a matter that God would have to decide, but we wouldn't say that they were baptized simply because they had that desire. Because for one thing, we can't look in people's souls to see what their desires are. We can only see their actions.
Right. And then the other issue would be this would be problematic, I would think. I mean, this is just me talking. The whole theology of the incarnation, the whole need. Why would the Lord say water and the Spirit? I mean, there's a physical aspect to our salvation that we couldn't set aside in any way. I mean, it's another thing to theoretically say maybe how the Lord will judge. You know, we can speculate, and we shouldn't. But another thing to say, yeah, this is like alongside baptism, we have this other possibility without any kind of, martyrdom. You have the blood flowing. There's variety, but it seems that this would be problematic to start relativizing things maybe a little bit, or ignoring the physical end of things.
Right.
I don't know. Another question, I'll put it on the screen here. Does the Didache say that one can be baptized by sprinkling?
Well, it talks about pouring. Sprinkling, I suppose you could say by extrapolation, might be acceptable if the circumstances warranted it, but pouring would be the normal means.
So the Didache does not explicitly say something, but if there's, to my knowledge, right, sprinkling does it.
Right.
Okay. So pouring, yes, but all right, let's see. Next question would be, I'm kind of putting these, I want to put these on the screen, so it's taking a little bit longer to get them there. If parishes don't have a baptistry suitable for adults, can they use a 50-gallon barrel or something equivalent, a river, pond, lake, or ocean? We kind of already answered that.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, that's pretty much the practice in a lot of places. I mean, it's not just can they, but
I was baptized in a horse trough. That's everybody in my parish that's been baptized and as an adult's been baptized in a horse trough.
And that's nothing to do with ivermectin, right?
No.
And anyway, it's proven effective now. They say that CDC says you can use ivermectin. So is the baptism of the Latins valid? So that's a question that sounds like a question.
I think the key question is, I have an article I wrote on this subject, is what do you mean by valid? And I think valid means, the way that it's been typically used, means form. Because we don't talk about their Eucharist being valid, because obviously we can't partake of it. But we do talk about a certain kind of a baptism being valid or invalid based on the form, but it doesn't mean that it's valid in the sense that it is the same thing as our baptism.
Right. So validity, if we use it, which I never found it in the Fathers. I think it's a very late term. Engerotita in Greek is the term. I didn't find it in Engerotita. They don't talk about Engerotita, as far as I know, in the canons. And there's actually a really interesting article by an Anglican about the 1930s that he was a canon of the Anglican Church. He did some really good research on the Orthodox perspective on economia. And he says, no, validity is not the Orthodox way of talking. It's authenticity, he claims. So even an Anglican said, no, we don't talk about validity in the East. But if we do talk about it later on, because the terminology from the West made its way to the East, and we have saints like Saint Nicodemus and other saints that definitely used terminology that was common in the West, maybe but in an Orthodox way, I would say. And if we do say validity, it's just the form,
right?
Like, we're not talking about anything beyond that, because that would imply another ecclesiology.
Right. I know in in St. Ignatius of Antioch's epistles, the English translation that I have talks about the bishop determining what is valid in terms of the Eucharist and baptism. But what I don't know is what it says in Greek, because I don't have the Greek text. But it'd be interesting to find out what the word was there.
Do you remember the exact citation? We could maybe look it up real quick.
It's to the epistle to the Smyrnians, and I believe it's in chapter 8. I reference it in my article. I actually give the quote in my article.
I don't know if Jason or somebody could find the Greek and send it to me, or anybody could find the Greek and send it to me. I could read it. You could see it. That would be fascinating. That'd be really interesting to see what the Greek said, if there is validity in St. Ignatius.
If I was going to guess, I would say it's probably an interpretive move on the part of the translator, because that is, I think, later terminology. And I think when we use later terminology than people before us, but hopefully we're using it in ways that are compatible with the Orthodox faith, because we live in a thought world that isn't limited to just people who are reading patristic literature. But the question is not whether you use new terms. It's whether you're using new terms in an Orthodox way or not.
Yeah, sure. Translation is very difficult, and there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration. So sure. This is another question from Orthodox Christian Theology, our friend Patrick Trulia. What's Father John's opinion of the Council of Jerusalem 1672? I'm assuming with respect to this question is what he is implying.
Well, it's a pan-Orthodox council. The only thing that I've discovered is an issue with it is apparently the Confession of St. Dositheus did go through some revisions, and there's some question about which revision was actually accepted by other churches. And St. Philaret of Moscow actually had his own translation of the version that apparently the Russian church accepted, which is a little bit different. So what I would love to see is somebody who's an Orthodox patristic scholar who would write a book or something, or at least an in-depth article on this question to talk about what version was the authoritative version. I know a lot of people tend to dismiss pan-Orthodox councils during that period of time as if they have any meaning, but they certainly were thought of being authoritative text by the church, and I don't think there's any reason why we should dismiss them.
Mm-hmm. So I think that Patrick has done some work recently on this particular topic of Patriarch Dositheos and Peter of Megillah, and their understanding of there being a need for triple immersion for the reception of Western Heterodox, which is really interesting. He's really good work. Last two articles that he posted, which I guess I'm not a scholar on this topic. I haven't sat down and done a lot of research on these two councils, or the texts rather produced by these two ecclesiastical, Saint or Peter Megillah, but that seems to be something that maybe wasn't well known and now is coming out through more research. I don't know. Have you looked at that at all?
Well, I have a copy of a book that's was produced by some Anglican scholar, I think, more than 100 years ago, where he translated it and he had an introduction. But the problem is, when you're depending on a non-Orthodox scholar to tell you about something like this, you never know when they're misinterpreting things because they're reading it through a non-Orthodox lens. So that's my only caution about saying take the text as we have it in English translations as being infallible. I would love to see an Orthodox scholar. So somebody's looking for a PhD topic. If you're an aspiring Greek patristic scholar, this would be a good one for you to take on.
Well, my son is in Thessaloniki right now. He's coming back. He's finishing up his undergraduate in theology at the University of Thessaloniki, and he just bought today the 5 volumes of Patriarch Dositheus' Dodekavelos. So he's bringing it back with him, and we're going to be able to check it out firsthand in Greek. So that'll be interesting. Another question: is the Orthodox Church infallible? If so, how so?
It certainly is, but when you're talking about the infallibility of the church, it's the church as a whole, not individual parts of it or individuals in it. So we know that when the church as a whole affirms something, that it's infallibly true. There are things that we've had like, for example, we have statements that come out of the Russian church on a particular topic. And so for those of us that are in the Russian church, it's certainly authoritative for us because, these are documents that our church in councils have affirmed. But until and unless you have the entire church either in a council or by every local church at some point affirming a document as being a true statement of the faith, you can't say that it's necessarily infallible, although it might be. I mean, any council that ever has later been declared to be infallible, there wasn't that imprimatur given to it right off the bat. It's only later on when you see how something that's received that you can say the church as a whole has embraced this.
You might add that, obviously there have been many false councils. So when we talk about infallibility, we're not talking from the beginning going into the council. As you said, it's clearly there's a process and it's going to be embraced by the church during the council, after the council, over time, the other local churches. Maybe one of the things that people are getting hung up on are is the term infallible the best term from an Orthodox perspective? We would say that the councils are without error. If that's infallible, then okay. But if you mean something else that's implied, I don't know what, maybe in a different context in Western theology, there's some other implication. But by divine inspiration, I mean, we say the scriptures are by divine inspiration. We say the councils are by divine inspiration. So in that sense, they're infallible. But if some people want to use divine inspiration instead of infallible because the implications are different. I don't see any real difference, but
St. Nicodemus in the Rudder does compare the ecumenical councils as being on the same level of authority as Scripture, and they do use the word infallible. And I don't know of any way that you could say something's infallible other than to say that it has no error,
which means exactly the same thing. So it's kind of a quibble. Father Theodore Zisis, who's very well known in Greece and for many texts on the fathers. I don't know if you've seen his book by New Rome Press, but he makes statements which I think the Orthodox would say, yeah, of course, but it's shocking for the non-Orthodox world. He says that basically the fathers and the scriptures, like you just said, they're both inspired by God. They're both, and basically in that sense, they have the same authority. And because the Holy Spirit is, as the Lord promised, guiding the church in all truth and throughout the ages. So this sharp distinction that developed in the West between the scriptures and everything else doesn't exist in Orthodoxy. Right.
And we wouldn't say that an individual father is infallible, but when you're talking about what the fathers as a whole taught,
yes,
we have ecumenical canons that tell us we're supposed to interpret the scriptures in accordance with what the fathers taught. And so you can't separate the scriptures from what they mean. Those two things are inextricably connected.
Right. So this is the next question. What's wrong with being received by chrismation? My priest said there's no consensus on this matter.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being received by chrismation when there's a good precedent for it. But as we've talked about, there are issues, and there's more issues with some people of some backgrounds than there are with others. If you look at the Hapgood Service Book, which is a translation based on pre-revolutionary Russian service books, you have a service for the reception of the non-Orthodox, and it lists different groups that are received that way. But one notably absent group in that list is Baptist, and they didn't fail to mention Baptists because there were no Baptists in Russia. There were actually a lot more Baptists in Russia than there were Lutherans or Reformed. During the time of the Protestant Reformation and the aftermath, where you had both Protestants and Catholics that were killing Anabaptists en masse, you had a lot of Anabaptists that were allowed to settle inside the Russian Empire. And as long as they minded their own business, they were allowed to live in peace. So you've had Baptists in Russia for a long time, but the fact that they were not listed, I think, is an indication of the fact that it was just understood that these people are not, you can't receive them that way. And yet that's how they're often received. Now, what do you do when somebody has been received that way is a different question. I personally don't think that if somebody's received that way, if the bishop that received them said that's how they were supposed to receive, I think that's that the economia or the grace of the Holy Spirit fills up that which was lacking. But whether that should have happened, I would say, is definitely no. It should not have happened. When you talk about Roman Catholics, there's obviously more of a precedent for it, but it does get into the questions that Father Peter raises, which is, well, they don't baptize by triple immersion, and so is the proper form really there? And it's certainly a matter that you could debate. But when you're talking about Baptists, it's a lot more debatable because it's a single immersion. I've heard of some Baptists saying that they baptize by a triple immersion, but that would be an exceptional case.
Yeah. Our position in the book and my position is that the minute that they depart from the form, I mean, this is what St. Nicodemus says and others, that the basis for economy ceases, because now you're undermining the very meaning of baptism. I mean, baptism means immersion. It means, in the Orthodox tradition, it means triple immersion, one for each of the names of divinity, the persons of divinity. So there's no, in my mind, in the book's position is there's no doubt that when we chrismate, we apply economy when there's no form, even then we're not following the Holy Fathers. That's I think it's made. The case is made, and we need a correct course when we're doing it. The question of what do you do afterwards is a really good question. I think we have to address that, but I don't know if it's the time to address that. I feel uncomfortable saying there's nothing to worry about, go on with your life, but I also don't know what to say definitively in the terms of, I can't make the case for you right now. Here are the fathers, here are the patristic texts. It's very interesting to me that, and people write this off all the time as some kind of elder, what do they call it? Elderism, or I don't know what they call it.
Elder worship. I think they might have used that phrase.
Oh yeah. Which is really, I want to address that because I think it's thoroughly unorthodox. The idea that the church following contemporary saints and elders is somehow anti-conciliar or anti-synodical and anti-bishop. The bishops are meant to be taken from the monasteries. That's the norm. They're meant to be taken from the monasteries, indeed, because of their great virtue. That's why the church said, let's go from the monasteries. There's no dogmatic decision. They only have to be from the monasteries. It's a practical, spiritual decision. It's been in place for 1,300-400 years. And the church has always done it because it makes sense from the monasteries to take the bishops. Well, so to say that we're going to follow the Holy Fathers, let's say on Mount Athos, is not at all somehow anti-conciliar, anti-episcopal, because the bishops should be from the monasteries, and they should be of one mind, and they should be of exceptional virtue and celebrated by monastics. This war that we've created between bishops and monks is unorthodox. It should not be, and if it does exist, it's a distortion and a perversion, and it's a symptom of secularization.
Well, as is the case, though, like with the dispute between Saint Cyprian and Saint Stephen, the Pope of Rome, is you had two saints that disagreed. So you do have that issue that not all the saints are on the same page, even the contemporary ones. But I agree with you that you certainly shouldn't blow off people who are holy men. And I'll tell you what I told the guy that I mentioned that was baptized in the Balkans by having 3 buckets of water poured over his head, because he kept pressing me, should I have a corrective baptism? Should I have a corrective baptism? I finally told him, look, go to your bishop, tell him how you were received, and if your bishop says you should have a corrective baptism, then have a corrective baptism. But if he tells you that you shouldn't worry about it, then don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. Because bishops have the power to bind and to loose, and we have to trust our bishops. And if your bishop is a heretic, then you need to find another bishop. But if you have a real bishop, I think that we have to trust their judgment.
Let me ask you then, what do you do with the contemporary Athonite practice? Which, let me just say what it is, because a lot of people might not know it. And you have elders, including St. Paisios. We have a story of a good friend who was told to go get corrective baptism by St. Paisios. Of course, Elder Ephraim And it's well known that all the monasteries in Athos under Elder Offend, but all the monasteries almost, with maybe one or two exceptions, maybe three, I don't know, because there's definitely not, Athos is reflective of the church. It's not monolithic, but there's an Athonite tradition, Athonite practice, which is pretty universal on certain things. So there are people, Americans that I know, who went to become monks in Athos, and they were received by chrismation, and they were routinely correctively baptized. There was never a bishop asked. Nobody asked a bishop. Of course, Athos is unique because it's kind of autocephalous almost in its, but
the authority of an abbot is not entirely analogous to the authority of a bishop, but there's certainly a lot of similarities. That's the reason why on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, bishops and abbots do the rite of orthodoxy, whereas at least in Russian practice, we don't do that on a parish level, because that's
sure.
Those proclamations are unique to them.
So but there was a challenge to that practice by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1992. They sent an exarchate, and they kind of went toe-to-toe, the Holy Community and the Fathers, over the reception. This was actually reception, not a corrective baptism, but it's the same theological debate, basically, right? It's very similar anyway. But they went toe-to-toe, and the Fathers responded that basically, look, the 1755 decision or 55 decision of the three patriarchs is the last formal decision of the Patriarchate, and that's what we're following. And the Patriarchate turned around and left, and they know, everyone knows all around the Orthodox world that the Athonites are baptizing those who've been received, because they say that the form is not kept, and therefore this reception is called into question, is problematic. Now, I'm not saying that the church here in the hierarchy here has to follow Athos, or that we should follow Athos necessarily. I'm not implying that. I'm just saying that it's troubling to me in a good way. A good uneasiness is given to me as somebody who's been to Athos, I don't know, dozens of times and talked to many Athonites. They're the successors of some of the greatest saints of the church. They're trying to apply the theology of some of the greatest saints of the church, Palamas. We've looked to them for 1,000 years for their missionary work, for the Paisian tradition in Russia. There's so much that in other ways we bow to Athos. I just stand in awe when we don't bow to Athos on this. Let's say the episcopacy. Let's say we're having a discussion of this. Let's say there were 5 Athonites at the table, 5 bishops, we're discussing this. I would, Father Peter here is having lived around Athonites, I would go with almost like reverence to Elder Parthenios of St. Paul's, the publisher of I Confess One Baptism by Father George Mattel. After being an abbot for 50 years, an ascetic for 70, 80 years, 75 years, these are the kind of people that the church used to run to, like St. Simeon the Stylite, or, whatever, the people throughout church history. You see the emperors and bishops coming to them and seeking their advice. For whatever reason today, we're so polarized. And it's like, the Athonites are in their own world, and everybody else is like, just, ignore the Athonites. It's what your bishops say. Yes, of course, what the bishops say. The bishop's authority is not questioned even by the Athonites. But I'm just saying, why aren't we paying more attention to that? Like, why do we pay attention to them when they talk about the Jesus prayer? But nobody cares that St. Paisius said, that's wrong, get it correct, the baptism. Do you see what I mean? Where I'm getting at?
Well, I certainly don't think that we should blow them off. Now, I'd also point out that there are a lot of other important centers of monasticism around the Orthodox Church, and I'm not sure that they all take the same view, and they have traditions of eldership. But I think that it's foolish for anybody to blow off the living saints, because I think the Holy Spirit leaves us with living saints at any given point in church history, and these are the people that we should be looking to.
It raises the question also, what is authority in the church, and spiritual authority, charismatic? I mean, these are questions we can't get into tonight, but there's a lot of things I think behind the different approaches, where you have people who are critics of this book, and they're going to appeal, they're going to make certain appeals to whatever sin is that they prefer to appeal to, or whatever episcopal authority they put. But there's like a chasm developing which should never have developed. If you go back, for instance, to the Church of Greece in the 19th century, a lot of people don't know that there was a systematic shutting down of the monasteries, and there was a concerted effort to introduce essentially celibate priests, take them out of the monastery, put them in the world, make them parish priests, make them future bishops. This has been going on for 200 years in Greece, a concerted effort. There's books written about this in Greece. That's got to be connected to our contemporary, monastic, pro-monastic, Athonite, anti-Athonite reality. I think it's worth exploring, because if we don't get that conciliarity on a more general level, we won't ever come to a consensus today, right?
Right.
If they don't play their role and they don't listen, and the bishops don't listen to them, and they don't listen to the bishops, or at least are fully informed of what's going on outside of Athos, it's always going to be like this. Like, there's always going to be that's in the parish, that's in America, that's in this, and that's in the Athonites. But these are actually topics that are universal. Like, reception is not a Athonite topic that we don't have to worry about. It's universal and it needs to be dealt with universally. Anyway, these are just my musings, because I know this is part of the criticism out there. I don't mean to pontificate. That's Tell me.
In the recent history of the church, though, I would point out you have the example of St. John of Shanghai, who, from everything I've been able to determine on the subject, I don't remember reading him writing on this subject, but from what I understand, people were received by chrismation under his authority. And I think that even if he didn't agree that that was the best way to receive people, just from what I have read about him and know about him, I think that his attitude would have been, well, until the Russian church as a whole changed its policy, I don't have the authority to make this decision on my own.
It's interesting. People, I think that's a good point. And I think the position of St. John is often called upon, as is Father Seraphim Rose with this whole question. My understanding, just to clarify things, because we've done some research on this, is that actually St. John did not chrismate Father Seraphim, but Bishop Tikhon did.
Yeah, it happened before he became to San Francisco, but I've not seen anything that indicated that he was going against the Russian practice on that subject.
No, I don't think there is. And there is an explanation that we do give in the book in chapter 4 about this question. If we're right, and the patristic consensus is that the immovable presupposition for proper economy is triple immersion, that would mean the Russian church was not following it during St. John's time, apparently, right? Because the heterodox had long departed from that. So then what do? You have to reject St. John? Is it like St. John or no? I think there's an explanation. We give it in the book, and I forget the chapter. What is it, like chapter 4? We talk about, on the basis of the writings of the fathers, especially St. Barsanuphios, and it's very well done, very beautifully explained. I don't know if you remember that chapter, but we talk about what happens when your fathers have received uncritically from their fathers something that actually is not reflective of the patristic consensus. And St. Barsanuphios is asked, and he answers, and he explains how this that if this God-bearing elder, even a clairvoyant elder, does not turn in prayer to God and say, essentially question their own fathers, right? Which is not something you normally do, right? So then he's not going to be informed, and he's going to continue humbly and obediently to do what he's been passed down to do. Doesn't necessarily mean that he's sinful or that he's right. There's actually a third option. And that's how we could explain saints like St. Philaret of Moscow, for instance, who apparently did not follow what the book considers the patristic consensus, or other comments by saints in the 19th and 18th century. That's one way to understand it. Now, you might say, well, the people might object to that, but they'll probably object to that because they don't agree that that's a patristic consensus. But if you do agree that this is a patristic consensus, that it needs to be triple immersion for it to be a proper blessed economy, then this is an explanation that could make sense.
Well, I think that there's also another way of looking at this, though, is if you go back to St. Dionysius of Alexandria, my understanding is that he leaned in the direction of St. Stephen's view, but that he said that nevertheless, Saint Cyprian can do what he wants in his own jurisdiction. I mean, that local church made this decision, and so in that jurisdiction, that's what they do, and that's fine. So I think it's possible that you could have different local churches that have different practices without it being a contradiction in their faith.
There's different approaches to economy, but can there be different? Can there be a different patristic criteria? In other words, Saint Dionysius was saying it doesn't matter if there's a baptism. The heretics were not even baptizing, immersing. I don't think that was at stake in the 3rd century.
Well, I don't think anybody would say that you could receive by somebody by economia when they haven't been baptized. But the question is if the form is off in a certain way, does that mean there was no baptism at all?
Well, the question is, what is baptism then?
Right, and
that's really important.
And the thing of it is, whether something is correct or not, I do think that there is something to be said for people who are humbly accepting what is the norm in their local church. I overheard a conversation between Metropolitan Nicholas of Roquefort and Metropolitan Jonah. Without getting into the specific issue, I'll just say that Metropolitan Jonah was making the case that there was a certain practice in Russian tradition that was really incorrect, and Metropolitan Nicholas simply said, Vladika Loris did this, Vladika Vitali did this, Vladika Anastasi did this, Vladika Antoni did this. This is the tradition I've received, and this is the way it's going to be. and I think there is something to be admired in that attitude. Now, you could still say, well, they could have been wrong, okay, but there's a humility to that attitude and I think even if it is wrong in some sort of an ultimate sense, I think that God would honor that nevertheless. And I think God's able to work around our mistaken opinions, even if it is a mistaken opinion.
I think it depends what we're talking about. What is that practice that's been handed down that our fathers have continued in, and it really would depend on, does it touch on our salvation? Does it touch on the mysteries of God? Or does it touch on a liturgical practice that is really, there's various liturgical practices. Or just, I mean,
some of these things are matter. There's judgment calls. I mean, for example, you have cases where somebody's received in a certain way and there's questions that's raised by it. And then the bishop is asked, what do we do in this case, Vladika? And it might be a question that's not exactly ever been asked, at least not in any recorded history of the church, where he can say, well, here's what the answer is. The bishop has to make a judgment call in that case. And I think we have to assume that the Holy Spirit, that what that bishop binds on earth is going to be bound in heaven. And when he looses on earth, is going to be loosed in heaven.
Right.
Now, obviously, there are limits to that, because if the bishop said, well, the priest married a gay couple and I'm okay with that, well, then we'd say no. that now you're a heretic, Vladika.
So then the question becomes, what are the boundaries? What are the limits to the episcopal, what's the word?
Discretion, you might say. Discretion,
or his ability to go freely left or right, to follow an economic route. That really is at the heart of the question of economy and how it's applied, not so much of ecclesiology, but how it's applied. But is that really a mystery? I mean, I guess that's the point we're trying to make in the book, is that is not a mystery. It's been handed down. There's a consensus. There has to be a criterion consensus that the bishop's going to work within the confines of that tradition that's been passed down. Right. So
well, I would definitely say that if stuff is going on that ought not go on, that we should make the effort to try to convince people that it ought not go on.
Sure. We agree with that.
But I think that if you're talking about what's happened in the past, I could, when you go, I went to Moldova last year, and I didn't observe anything objectionable, but I'm just using this as an example. In the parish of the village that I spent the most time in, you had two brothers who were both priests. The older brother was the rector, the younger brother was an assistant, and their father was like the priest emeritus. And if a priest saw his father baptizing babies in a certain way, and he just assumed that it was correct because my father did this,
Sure.
and he was baptizing children that way. I don't think that that would imperil the soul of either that priest or that person. But if it was not correct, I think nevertheless you should say, well, your father didn't know better on this.
Right.
As saintly as he certainly was, this should be done differently, and try to convince them to be more careful about it. But
Right.
I think we have to have a view of
That
God's
presumes,
grace and mercy that is able to,
yeah.
go beyond an innocent misjudgment like that.
So I mean, you're going into the question of like the consequences or the guilt or what. I'm not even going there. That's the second question. I agree with you. There's a a room to move, so to speak. But what before we get there, there has to be an agreed understanding of what's been received. And so we're correcting that priest or that son of that priest on a basis of what's been received. Right. That's why we're saying your father didn't do it correctly, because actually there is something that's canonically, pastorally, theologically, spiritually correct. Right. That's been taught to us by the fathers. And so that is, there's no room to, in my mind, economy doesn't allow for us to abrogate that and put it aside and say, well, no, we can do X, Y, Z here because, well, we have economy or we have the power to loose and bind. We don't, that power can't be pitted against what's been received from the Holy Fathers and the Holy Tradition. These things can't be at odds. Does that make sense? I mean, we agree. I think we agree on that.
I would agree with it up to a point. I would just say that when you have the messy situation of a bishop who's handed something that maybe was not the way that it absolutely should have happened, and he makes a judgment call about, okay, what do we do about it now? That we have to assume that if he's not doing something that's just insane, that that God's grace is there.
That's in the realm of like emergency baptism or something.
Right.
We're outside of the norm or the exactitude that's been handed. Anyway, these are awesome. We could go on rabbit trails all night. Let me get back to some of these questions. I think we had one already queued up. Let me see. Did we even answer? We answered that, right? What's wrong with being receiver? Yeah, we answered it. Yeah. All right. And then we answered that one. So let me go on to the next one. Let me just read this to make it quicker. I'm hoping to be a catechumen and one day be baptized. If my priest refuses because I was once baptized a long time ago in a stupid Protestant church, would it be wrong to offer payment? That sounds strange.
It'd be wrong to offer payment.
Yeah, I think that would be wrong. I think maybe if the question was, would it be wrong to, I don't know, go to another priest or protest, that's a question you should ask. But to offer payment, I don't think you should offer payment for anything in the church. Yeah. Okay. Let's ask that question. So there are a lot of people asking this question. So I'm a catechumen, and I'm in a place where they refuse stridently to baptize. They believe that the economy is the rule, and there are jurisdictions that have that position.
Right.
What do I do when I've come to the conclusion, my conscience is telling me I believe actually that's not a baptism that I had. I don't want to be received by consummation. Well, what do I do? Do I say there's one person in a parish, a bishop told me about this. He's waiting 4 years because he refuses to be received by consummation and the priest refuses to baptize him. So he's a catechumen 4 years. There's other people who flee to go to another priest after, whatever, waiting and waiting. What do you think? Is this pastorally solvable, or are we just going to have a parting of the ways?
It's a difficult situation to just give sort of a blanket answer to that question. I think a lot would depend on whether you had an alternative parish to go to. So in other words, if the only parish within 300 miles of you was this parish, I think the answer might be a little bit different than it would be if there was another parish that was, across the street or down the road, that this wasn't going to be an issue, because you need to be in a parish where you're going to be able to receive the mysteries. And also, if you have a priest or he's under a bishop who's spouting heretical ideas, that's obviously a whole nother question too. But beyond that, I would say a lot if I was making this decision, as a layman, a lot for me would depend on what my own background was. And if I was a Roman Catholic, for example, and had been baptized as such, I would feel a lot more comfortable with being received by chrismation, because at least there's a long precedent for that. Even though you can make the case like you have that it's questionable now because of the way that they do it. But if I was a Southern Baptist, I would not want to be received by chrismation, because I don't think it's proper. And I don't think that you can even make the case that it's proper.
I don't see any real difference in the canons and the fathers between a single immersion and a sprinkling or pouring. You're making that distinction, but we didn't find that.
Pouring or sprinkling could be acceptable under some circumstances, and so that when you're talking about should they have done it because the circumstances really didn't warrant it, doesn't take away from the fact that it is a form that at least could be acceptable. And so I can see why a bishop would say, well, even though it shouldn't really have been done because it wasn't a need, it's still a form that's acceptable. So in this case, I'm going to allow it.
I don't think you can make that case when you're talking about reception from the heterodox. And then you have canons also, because that's one thing in the church, nothing in the heterodox. But you also have canons where two canons ecumenical strength that say if someone in the church, let alone the heterodox, has been understood that they've been not baptized, in other words, not been immersed, triple immersed, they should be baptized. So we have a canon from 419 and in Trullo. So the church seems to err on the side of conservative, like when in doubt, baptized means triple immersion. So if you know the person's not been triple immersed, I don't understand why that's somehow more of a safe bet than a single immersion. I mean,
I think when you're talking about the reception of Roman Catholics this way, you've got almost 1,000 years worth of precedence of it being allowed at least by many bishops.
But
with Baptist, I don't think you even have 100 years of that being the case.
We don't have, but that's not accurate, Father. That's not accurate. There's not 1,000 years of precedent. There's 300 or more since about the 17th century. Because the first 550 years of the Russian Church, they baptized all the Latins, and the Greeks did it, and then they went back to it in the 18th century. So that's what's been rejected from the 18th century on in the Greek Church officially, and in the Pedalian. So I don't think there's the precedent you're talking about. Well, is not nearly.
You mentioned Saint Mark of Ephesus. I think that is at least a precedent, even if you want to say that maybe he would have a different opinion now, and probably he would. I would hasten to say I wish that bishops would just stop making this an issue and say, look, if particularly in cases when people want to be received by baptism, why tell them no? I could see some cases where you have somebody who maybe are teetering on the brink, and this is an issue for them, because St. Basil's first canon does talk about this being a stumbling block for someone as a reason for applying economia. But if it's not a stumbling block, then there obviously is no reason to apply economia. So why do it?
Again, the context and the presuppositions for that was that we're talking about baptism. We're not talking about a departure from baptism, which is what the norm is today and has been for hundreds of years. So when we take the examples of St. Basil or others from church history, we have to remember that there was no question as to the form. We don't have any reason to believe in the first millennium that the heretics, except for the Eunomians who are named, had departed from the form. And so you've got to have that in mind. And that's where people get off. They say, well, we did chrismation, for hundreds of years, or we did chrismation in the church history. Yes, but why? And on what basis we did chrismation? Was it? And so that's the heart of this debate or this discussion.
And I think this book makes a really good case for why we should not continue that practice. I'm just saying that I think that you can at least make an argument in some cases as to why you would do it, whereas there are other cases where you move beyond the argument.
There's definitely degrees of departure in terms of the form. Yeah.
Right.
But okay, let's go to the next question. I think it's this one. Mark Rowe, I have not heard any critic that was actually baptized. The ones I heard were all received by chrismation and some were clergy. Maybe they take it personally.
Well, obviously people who were received by chrismation, it's a matter of, that can be troubling for them. And that's one reason why I think that we should want to tell people that unless there's some exceptional circumstance, if they were received the way the bishop said that they were supposed to receive, and if it was incorrect, that the sin is on the bishop and not on them. And I think, along with my understanding of what our bishops think, is that there's not a necessity for a corrective baptism unless there is something a lot more wrong with the form than what we're talking about. But I also would say I've never met a single person who was received by baptism who came back later and said, I shouldn't have been received this way. It's been a stumbling block for me ever since. I've never had that happen, but I've certainly had people who were troubled who were received by chrismation. I just wish that the bishops would get past this, particularly when people are asking for it. I mean, I could see it in some cases when the person's where being baptized would be a problem, but I can't see it when they're saying, "Please baptize me." There's no reason.
I got to tell you the story. I got to tell you the story, which is exactly this point, and it just happened last month when I was at the Antiochian Convention. There was a priest there. It doesn't matter who it is, but he's well read, and I think he's sincere, and I think he's knowledgeable. But I was blown away. I went to him with this exact question. I said, Father, somebody's begging to be baptized, and you or anybody turns and says, no, like, under no circumstances can you be baptized. You must be chrismated. At that point, I don't understand the stance, because economy is about necessity. When there's no necessity, why economy? If somebody's begging you for baptism, why reject it? And his answer was very illuminating for me, because it points to the deep problem that we have today. And his answer was, because there's grace in the mysteries, and we must not baptize. And economy has to be the rule because there's grace in the mysteries. And I said to him, Father, that means we have a different ecclesiology. This isn't about economy anymore. This is about ecclesiology. Now you've painted a different image of the church to me. And then he doubled down and said, well, actually, there's a practice that is going to be cited in a future paper, et cetera, that says that there was a time period, apparently, I've never heard of this, and we've done a lot of research. I've never heard anything like this, that somehow in maybe the 16th, 17th century, I don't know, he didn't specify, that the Orthodox were receiving Latins just by an anointing of oil and not as chrismation. Therefore, we were implicitly implying that they had the grace of the mysteries. Therefore, our position has been that there's grace in the mysteries of the heterodox. Now, even if this exists, we don't base our ecclesiology on some practice for 100 or 200 or even 500 years. We base it on the theology of the Apostle Paul and the canons and the theology of St. Basil and the whole theology of the church. We start there. So what you're saying is not just a dire spiritual and pastoral problem we have with people begging for baptism and getting denied, which is like mind-boggling in terms of why, but it's actually much worse. It's that we have a different vision of the church, which means a different vision of Christ ultimately, right? Because the church is the body of Christ.
Right.
I think that's where we're headed in many ways today.
Yeah, I would say that view is heretical. And I'm not saying that means the priest is himself, condemned heretic. It just means that he's saying something that's heretical, whether he realizes it or not. And as far as people being received only by anointing with oil, I've never heard of that. Now, I have heard that at various points when the boundaries of the Russian Empire would change, that you had people who were forced into unia who were received in mass without being chrismated. And it was basically by a profession of faith and a renunciation of errors that they were received. And that's because you had people who basically never wanted to be uniates in the first place. And so there was economia that was applied, but they would have been baptized the same way as the Orthodox had been baptized, and every other respect, the forms would have all been correct. And so that was that was what they did. But I've never heard of this thing of the oil being the means of reception.
Yeah, I never heard of it either. Another question: how important is it that the baptism is performed during divine liturgy? What about baptism performed on its own?
Well, I think the idea of a baptismal liturgy, the way that St. Vladimir Seminary is promoted, is a bit iffy. The way baptisms were done, say on Holy Saturday, was you had priests that were baptizing people in a baptistry apart from the liturgy. And then the liturgy was going on. And that's why you have all these Old Testament readings that are going on, because it covered the time that was needed. But after the people were baptized, they were brought into the church, and then they received their first communion. But it wasn't something that was going on in the middle of the service. And I think the same thing is true. The idea of a wedding that's merged into a liturgy, I think, is a bit iffy, because I've never seen one. I've read the order of service, and to me, I think that would be a very distracting element to a liturgy, because when you have a wedding, all the eyes are on the bride. Oh, this cute couple. You're thinking about their future together, and you're going to mix that in with a liturgy where you keep introducing this element of this couple and their future with the liturgy. I don't see how they go together. I mean, if you did a wedding before the liturgy, that would be one thing, but to do it and try to mix it with the liturgy, I don't think that there's, I've certainly never seen any ancient manuscripts of such a wedding.
Well, I think the problem is how we do weddings today, not so much if a wedding theoretically can happen, but it's done in such a way today that it is distracting, and can be very worldly. Is that part of it, or do you think actually just?
Well, I think that, the theory behind a wedding liturgy is that they will point to quotes where basically people were married in the church by receiving communion together. Maybe there was some prayer that the bishop said. Well, if you had a very short prayer that was done at a certain point in the liturgy that united a husband and a wife, and then they received communion together, that would be one thing. But if you take all the elements of a wedding, going from the betrothal to the crowning to the dance of Isaiah, and then basically replace the common cup with the Eucharist, and then basically did the dismissal at the end and all that, I think that would change the focus of the liturgy to this couple, and it would be a distracting element.
Okay, what would you say the same about baptism, or no? Baptism is different.
Well, I think all the evidence that I've seen is that the baptisms that we're talking about, like on Holy Saturday or on the Christmas Eve, that these baptisms happened apart from the liturgy itself, and then the people were brought into the church. I mean, particularly back when you had baptisms in the nude, it would have been more than a little distracting to have had people getting baptized in the nude in the middle of the church. I don't think that happened. That's why you had separate baptistries.
What we had in, for instance, on Patristic, where I've been, where there's this massive church from the 5th century, the Thousand Gate Church, it's called. They have a separate baptistry to the right. It's a massive church. And so my understanding is that all the catechumens would be in the Divine Liturgy in the beginning. A lot of the same parts are in the Divine Liturgy that are in the first part of liturgy or in the baptismal service, but they would depart, for instance, on Holy Saturday. Why do we have so many readings? Because that's when they departed and the baptisms were taking place. So the actual immersions, the nudity and all that, they were not happening in the nave in the church, but they were happening in the chapel next door. Right. But the service shared many parts with the Divine Liturgy. The Holy God, the Epistle, the Gospel, going around the baptismal font, whatever. Maybe that was done then. Maybe that was done in the nave. So that would have been much more orderly than the whole thing right in front of everybody in the middle of the nave.
Right. And well, the thing is, though, is the way that it's often done on a parish level these days is you basically have the Holy Saturday liturgy being stacked on top of baptisms, and so you wind up elongating an already very long service, and I don't think that that's the way that it was done in ancient times. I think that basically the Holy Saturday liturgy would have had essentially the same length, but there would have been stuff that would have been happening out of view of most of the people.
These are pastoral matters that certainly can be done different ways, and I think that's why the church did it over time, because the church got big, right? And so there was need. But But what's interesting is that it was envisioned, in my understanding, it was envisioned always within the Eucharistic synodices, not necessarily practically in every Eucharistic synodices, but theologically, it certainly can't be understood outside because they're communing at the end in both baptism and the marriage. It's an integral part of it was an integral part of the mysteries, which points to the ecclesiological, obviously that this is all one. You can't separate it out. And that's really the important point today, I think. Forgive my ignorance, but if the Didache says baptism in living water is best, then why isn't that recommended by the church?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could make the case that maybe we should do it more often than we do, but I can tell you, I remember very vividly, I was ordained a deacon on the same day that there was a baptism that was done in a very chilly river in Texas in March. And I thought, and fortunately there was a deacon that was ordained the day prior to me. So that because he was the more senior deacon, he got to go into that freezing cold water and almost die of hypothermia. And I think one of them also cut their feet on some broken glass that was in the river. And so those are the kinds of issues that you run into these days, at least, when you're talking about going into a river that maybe in ancient times wasn't as big of a concern. And so, yeah, I've never baptized anybody in a river, but I'm certainly not wrong to do it. But I would want to at least have some Crocs on if I was going into a river in the United States where there's probably more than a few broken bottles of beer on the bed of the river.
Yeah. So in other words, that is the economia that's talked about in the Didache, but the church, keeping the need for 3 immersions, says, yeah, okay, practically it can happen in the temple, but it doesn't abandon the 3 immersions, where a lot of people think the Didache is indifferent to that. I think the proper reading of the Didache is that the first thing is living water, and it's clearly 3 immersions, and only when you don't have those and you're by need, you have to depart to other ways of doing it, then you depart. I think that's the most important point to make with the Didache. Sure, living water is great. Father Seraphim Rose used to go down to the rivers near Platina and do the baptisms. It's preferred, but it's not always practical. Where it is not really impractical today to do triple immersion. There's no reason why we shouldn't do that.
Right.
All right. Next question is, let me go back to the banners. And that is, I don't even know what this is. Is there an equivalent in Orthodoxy of ecclesia supplet, as is in Roman Catholic canon law? Would it be economia? I'm not familiar with
that term.
Maybe somebody who wants to let us know what supplet is applying to. Their dispensation would be the closest thing to economia, in my understanding.
Yeah, I think that they're equivalent terms in Latin and Greek.
Although dispensation implies other things. Father George Florossi talks about this, that dispensation is really not, it's more like a legal thing, like it's allowed, whereas economia,
well, that's the way it's come to mean that in the Roman Catholic context, but I think that the words have the same sort of they're analogous words in their roots, at least.
Father, bless, our nation is essentially agnostic because of the disdain for Protestantism. Why is it that the Orthodox are trying to be more like them than reaching out to the nation thirsting meaning, in thirst of meaning? I certainly am not trying to be more Protestant. I don't know about you, Father, but
no.
Maybe there are people out there.
God help them.
Yeah, I don't know if there are Orthodox out there who want to be more Protestant. God help them. I don't know what to say about that. Big long question here that I can't put on the screen because it's too extensive. I'll read it. Father Matthew, bless from Matthew. Sorry. Father bless, in 1 Thessalonians 5:11 it reads, therefore comfort each other and edify one another, just as you are also doing, quote unquote. St. John Chrysostom gives commentary on this, saying the following: you see, I wish and pray that you would all hold fast to right order as teachers, that you would not simply be listeners to what is said by us, but also transmit it to others, casting your net for those still in error, so as to bring them to the way of truth, unquote. Given this, what would you say about this idea being circulated that only a bishop has authority to transmit patristic teachings?
Well, I don't think that that's correct. I think obviously the bishops are the ones that we give the most deference to, and they're the ones that actually have the charge of the churches that are under their authority. But we certainly do believe that the faithful have something to say about what the bishops do. I can't remember the year, but there was a reply of the Eastern Patriarchs to the Pope at the time, to an overture for reunion, in which they made the statement that the faithful are the guardians of piety. And you saw that most vividly after the Council of Florence, where the bishops that came back after having accepted a shameful and false union were greeted with showers of stones and rotten fruit because the faithful didn't go for that. And so just because the bishops say to do something or that something is so, it doesn't mean that the faithful have to sit back and not say anything in response. But, you know, they have to generally be respectful, but obviously in the case of the people who've embraced a heresy, that's where your need to be respectful starts to become a little shorter, because no one condemns the people that were showering these bishops with with rocks, even though that's probably not a particularly respectful way to greet a bishop.
I'm reminded of, I mean, the return from Florence you're talking about. Is that
Exactly.
one of the things you haven't? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't seen personally the sources, but I'm told that they pushed them off into the pier or something very extreme. Like they were absolutely enraged that there was a false union, etc.
Metropolitan Isidore of Kiev, when he came back to Russia, was imprisoned because he had embraced the Unia, and I think he wound up escaping. Maybe they allowed him to escape because it made things simpler, but he wound up going to Rome and becoming a cardinal. But you know, the faithful have something to say, and there's no reason why the faithful have to sit back and let bishops espouse things that are heretical without saying you're wrong.
So is this questioner talking about those extreme cases where dogmatically there's error in the episcopacy, or is he saying more generally that Chrysostom is implying that when they receive the preaching, they should therefore themselves pass on that in a mode of a teacher?
Well, he certainly says that. He talks about that in terms of the scripture. He chides people in his homily is that, you know, you don't leave it all on us to teach people. You've been coming to church, you've been hearing these instructions. You should go home and make sure that your children are taught these things.
Right. That's really important. Points to the common bearing of the burden of the faith and the protection of orthodoxy, which is really essential. That's why what you pointed out. Yeah. Okay.
And obviously the bishops are not teaching every Sunday school class. So, you know, we want our Sunday school teachers to be teaching the faith correctly. Yeah. And so we're expecting laity to do that.
Yes. Okay. This is another question here. We got a bunch of questions and we've been going for quite a while. Let's see if we can get through them quick. Father bless, is there a canon that says that one shouldn't be baptized again if one was baptized with Holy Trinity? I heard there is one, and I don't know if the source of it. I don't know if he goes on. It says more. Hang on. I hope I make sense. Okay.
Well, there certainly are canons that say you shouldn't baptize somebody who was properly baptized a second time, but that doesn't apply to heterodox baptisms. And so there's no canon. Go ahead.
I was going to say St. Cyril of Jerusalem, who was at the Second Ecumenical Council, says clearly in his catechesis, we don't baptize a second time unless they're heretics, because their baptism is no baptism. So I think he expresses the dogmatic conscience of the church when he says that, and it's impressive that he was at the Second Ecumenical Council when we have the seventh canon, which talks about economy.
Right, because if there wasn't such a teaching, you might say, well, if someone apostatized, let's say to Islam or whatever, and then they came back to the church, then you might say, well, let's baptize them again. But the church is clear that baptism that they received prior to their apostasy can't be repeated, but they are received by chrismation when they've apostatized. So we're now receiving them back into the church, just like we would by economia if they were heterodox. But in this case, they received a true baptism in every sense of the word, but they departed from it as schismatics or heretics, and now we're receiving them back.
Right, which actually is interesting. I've heard some people say, and I don't know if this is the case, it's a modernistic practice or it's actually a legitimate practice, but I've heard some say that if someone apostatized to various heterodox confession, they don't have to always be received by chrismation. They could be received by confession of faith. The practice in Greece, at least, is that they must be chrismated. If they depart to any heterodox body, they must be chrismated when they come back, participating in their services, communing. I mean, not just like they visit, obviously. They actually become members of the heterodox body.
I know that when I've asked my bishop about cases where you start getting into the gray area, his criteria that he always asks is, did they ever renounce orthodoxy? Because you might have someone who maybe didn't know better. They were baptized as a child or an infant. They never really instructed in the faith. They come to the United States and there's a Russian Baptist church down the street. So they start going there because there are Russians there. They're Christians and they don't really understand the implications of it, but they're not doing this as an act of departing from the faith. And then later someone tells them, well, you know what? That's really not correct that you did that. You shouldn't have done that. If they're humble enough to accept, oh, well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that, that would be a different case than someone who at a certain point began to doubt the Orthodox faith, joined the Baptist out of conviction, but then later on realized that they had made a mistake.
Yeah. How can one apply economia for political reasons? All the examples I know of refer to extreme personal situations, such as the person is about to die or an invalid, etc.
I'm not sure what political reasons he's referring to, unless he's talking about the fact that St. Mark of Ephesus spoke about the fact that the Latins were stronger than us, and that might have some influence on them not receiving people by baptism. But in that case, as you pointed out, he at least, assumed they were still being baptized with the correct form. So it was certainly something that was within the judgment of the bishop. And so maybe if he thought that it was better to receive people that way than to have the Latins, start landing troops on their shores and taking over or something like that as a possible response, I suppose that maybe that's what he's referring to. And I don't know that we can say that a bishop would be wrong in that case.
Yeah. So if the presuppositions are met and there's some overarching political situation which makes it detrimental to the life of the church, puts them at risk. I mean, we don't understand that today because maybe we didn't live during the communist period or the Ottoman period. But if you're under the Ottoman yoke and you've got all these machinations from the various heterodox, I mean, there's all kinds of things going on that create danger for lives, human beings. They get hung, they get killed if they're so we're totally, I think, removed from that. And so that's why political reasons sounds bizarre, but it's actually immediately impacting the life of the church, the people, the bishops, the priests, the people in the church. It's not some, I don't know, contemporary politics, it's nothing like that. Let's see, we have a bunch of questions. For the interest of time, I'm not going to put them on the screen because it takes me time to do that. So I'm just going to rattle them off. Stephen Runciman explicitly says councils of Jerusalem 1672 and Iasi of Romania were not intended to be ecumenical. Curious if fathers have thoughts on Runciman's perspective.
Well, the thing is, even if that's true, if they're received as ecumenical, then that means they have ecumenical weight. And you have many local councils that were specifically affirmed by the second canon of the Council of Trullo, that even though they were not intended to be ecumenical councils, they have ecumenical weight because of that.
Well, look at the Second Ecumenical Council. Second Ecumenical Council was not called as an ecumenical council. Rome did not go. Right? It was basically a council for the Patriarchate of Constantinople and some in the East, and yet it was embraced as the Second Ecumenical Council. So I think whether it was called or not, it's kind of important because a lot of them were called as ecumenical, but it doesn't disqualify it from becoming ecumenical. Is the Russian practice of receiving Catholic priests as such, and he's talking about vesting, a departure from patristic teachings? That's a tough one. Do you want to answer that?
It still goes on, although I would say that it probably ought not to. But the thing is there precedent for doing it in the canons? There is, because you have the canons that talk about receiving clergy and rank, and so that's the basis for the practice. I think it made some sense when you're talking about, like I was referring to earlier, where the borders between Poland and Russia change, and now you've got all these villages that the people really were Orthodox originally. They were forced into union, and you've got the local parish priest, and you accept all these people en masse, and you accept that priest as a priest, even though he's ordained by a uniate bishop, but you receive him by vesting. I think that makes sense in that context. But when you're talking about a Roman Catholic priest becoming Orthodox today, I don't think that really probably is a good idea, because for one thing, it's confusing to a lot of people. And that's one of the reasons why you have people who make statements like, well, obviously we believe their sacraments are grace filled because of blah, 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 blah. And they start pointing to things like this. So I would say it's probably not a good idea to continue it, but it has precedent.
I wonder, though, I've never studied this, but I wonder if the practice, I think we're talking about the First Ecumenical Council and the Meletians, and that's what we're having in mind. Is that what you're having in mind?
There's various schismatic groups that were accepted as they were. And I think even St. Basil's first canon, towards the end, he talks about a certain group of people that were accepted into communion. And he certainly seems to suggest that maybe they shouldn't have been. But then he says, but the fact that they have been received that way has made it essentially like a canon that we should receive them into communion.
So that the question I would ask is, are those historical context and presuppositions met today? When I think about vesting, the reasoning behind it sounds really similar to what the Latin theology in the Middle Ages that I studied when I was looking at my PhD, the way they understood the indelible mark on the priest, even if he departs, he still retains it, et cetera, et cetera. There's an approach that this seems to be coming from there, an Augustinian thought, as opposed to the ecumenical councils. Now, I haven't done enough work to say that's the case, but I wonder, that would be a very interesting study. Like, what are the roots of vesting, not only historically, but theologically, and how have they been defended and how's it been carried out? And what did the fathers who looked at the canon that we're talking about in the First Ecumenical, did they see what was going on there? I think there's a departure, but I don't know. I can't speak definitively. I haven't looked at it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Joel, thank you for giving $20. That's something that's very nice. We don't ask anybody, but we'll certainly accept it when you do it. How should we answer the common retort that the Didache prescribes living water for baptism, implying that our position is lacking for not also arguing for baptizing the river? We can't just answer that, but right. Yeah, I think we answered that.
I would suggest people look at the bayous in Houston and ask themselves whether they would want to be baptized in such places.
Yeah. So.
There are crocodiles in there, for one thing.
I think it's living water and is one thing, triple immersion is another, and then departure from triple immersion and an economy is a different thing. And so I don't know if we have to defend living water if we're defending triple immersion. I don't think they're the same, but okay. Yeah. Let's go.
I would say if you lived along the Jordan River, it'd be a lot better. It'd be a lot more of an argument to say, let's go down to the river. and the Didache was written right around in that area, so I think that might have influenced the way they viewed things.
Yeah, we could. I mean, isn't there a song in the evangelical song? Let's go down to the river or something.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very famous.
There are a couple of country songs along those, or gospel songs along those lines. Yeah.
If they would just do it 3 times, maybe. How should we answer the? Okay, we already did that. I thought I pasted the new one. Hang on a second. That was given twice. That's why it's there. Hang on a second.
Hopefully, he got $40 then if he gave it twice.
No, I don't think so. I think it's more just here on the screen. It was pasted twice. All right. And this is Hilarion. If Father Seraphim Rose is already being venerated in areas of the world, and knowing he was received by chrismation, does this mean that his baptism in his previous denomination is valid? I'm going to try to give an answer to this. It doesn't mean anything. This kind of logical deduction is not. I don't think it's orthodox. The idea that we can imply things after the fact, and no, we have a teaching, we have a patristic consensus, we go to that, and then there are always exceptions. There's historical exceptions, and Father Seraphim's particular reception does not imply anything about our teaching generally, in my opinion. It could be an exception. It could be, understood in that if this was not done according to patristic teaching, then in spite of the error, God is not bound by the errors of men. He can bring about through great love and asceticism, Father Seraphim carried out. He can bring about great sanctification. So that kind of thing. Besides the fact that his baptism as a Methodist would have been not by triple immersion. So what does it even mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of baptism? Because this might sound legalistic, but it's not. The meanings, the words have meanings. The minute you depart from it, baptism means a triple immersion, then you're in the realm of Aquinas, you're in the realm of relativization of things. You've departed from the patristic mind. In my reading of things, it's not. It's no longer. And then the validity, the whole question of it being valid. We don't even talk like that in the Orthodox Church in terms of it meaning that it's a real spiritual event. If you mean it's valid in the sense that the form was there, well, that's the question. Was the form there? I don't think it would have been there in a Methodist in the 1950s or what was it, 40s? Maybe, probably not. So that's my take.
Yeah. What I would say is that it's an example of how the grace of the Holy Spirit can compensate for what was perhaps a failure in form. But the Grand Duchess Elizabeth is another famous example. And in our parish, and a lot of ROCOR parishes, the antimons that we celebrate the liturgy on have her relics in it. That's because we have her relics, and she's a martyr, and we need relics from martyrs to have antimons. And so quite a few ROCOR parishes are celebrating every liturgy on Antimencia that have her relics in it. And she was baptized as a Lutheran and received by economia. So I think obviously the Holy Spirit was able to fill up that which was lacking in the way that she was received.
Well, what could one say? Because I've heard this said that she was baptized in her blood, even if she was never triple immersed, she was baptized in her blood.
Well, I've heard there's a now a Greek Old Calendar bishop who was a priest or a hieromonk in ROCOR. I've heard say that exact thing, that she was only Orthodox by virtue of her having been martyred. And I don't think that's a thing that you would hear from many of the saints of the Russian Church Russian Church abroad. Like Metropolitan Anastasi wrote a very glowing biography of hers. I mean, not a full length one, but basically, a extended discussion about what a holy woman she was. And there's never any hint that, well, she wasn't really Orthodox until she was a martyr.
But that's a different sentiment entirely. That's a very legalistic way of looking at it. I didn't mean to imply that. I meant to imply that if there was something that she was received and never triple immersed, never baptized, then certainly she was baptized in her blood. So there should be no question that her sanctification. That doesn't mean she wasn't in the church and not Orthodox. People who
she was a holy woman prior to her martyrdom too, though.
Yeah,
and I think that's important.
She lived the life. She lived the life of the church. She was received in the church. She was communing. Nobody doubts that, and that sanctifies. But the question comes, well, that there was never a baptism. I mean, I'm going to double down on this, because the minute you start to say it doesn't matter if they're poured or sprinkled or immersed, you're not in the realm of patristic theology anymore, because nobody talks like that.
I wouldn't say that it doesn't matter, but I would say that when you have people who are baptized in a way that is at least acceptable under some circumstances, that it's a little bit murkier than it would be if they were baptized in a way that had no basis within the traditions of the church.
I didn't quite follow. They were baptized in circumstances that were somewhat acceptable.
If they were baptized in a form that is at least allowable under some circumstances in the Orthodox
Okay,
Church.
By economy. In other words,
right.
I see what you mean. But right. I don't know if there's any precedent for that. In other words, there's something that's been interesting. I've been meaning to mention. In the 3rd century, there was the Novatian Schism. You know the story. Craig Truly has talked about this, and they protested his elevation to the episcopacy. I mean, there were other reasons, but they also protested it, and it's kind of interesting. It reflects their mindset that he was baptized with a clinical baptism, and that disqualified him for ordination. And there seems to be also canons that the 50th canon, Nicodemus Milas talks about this, that he basically says something similar. Now, I'm not saying that trying to make a case for this. I'm just saying that there seems to be something lurking in the back of the minds of some church fathers, or at least the canons, interpreters of canons, that is saying that, at least for the priesthood, that if there's any doubt as to your reception or anything that's going on that's not totally according to ecclesia, then the priesthood should not be approached, because the priesthood should be, totally without any doubt, without anything. So it's interesting in that context, they see it as a problem for ordination. I never thought about that until I ran into those those two. So does that at all imply that the church is saying that there shouldn't be room when there's a departure from the form, and now we've abandoned the form, there shouldn't be an economy? That's what I'm. In other words, what's the basis for saying it doesn't matter? Like when the heterodox abandon the form, economy is now undermining ecclesia. How can I explain it? So when you're in Serbia and Bulgaria, and you're looking at everybody baptizing according to this economy, right? Which there's no reason for it, because there's no need. Where does that come from? It comes from a general departure from the form, and probably from the West, and the idea that doesn't matter, right? So if we run with that, it seems to me to undermine ecclesia generally. It seems to imply generally in church life we lose the sensitivity to the ecclesia, the exactitude of the mystery. Does that make sense?
Right, and you're never going to hear me say that the form doesn't matter. And I do think that there's times in the history of the church where people get lazy, or they get slack in certain areas, and then you have people who call them back to the standards. And I think this is one of these occasions where we need to do this. But it's a different question about what do you do about the people who are already received that way. And
so I would explain it as, in spite of this, God sanctified them.
Right.
Not that on the basis of this, God sanctified them. Because then you lay it down as a precedent, and you allow it as a kind of exactitude. Does that make sense? Like Father Seraphim was sanctified in spite of the error of receiving him without there being a canonical patristic consent. Does that make sense? If you say, well, they had the economic, it's still some kind of baptism, then you're giving that as a precedent, and economy can never be a precedent. Right?
I'd certainly not say that they were saints because they were received that way. So you could say in spite of, but I think that they were truly members of the church, and that whatever shortcomings there were in the way that they were received, that God's grace filled up that which was lacking.
But I would say, I can accept that, because obviously they've been sanctified, and people attest to their sanctity. But I would just point that as to a kind of the economy of God, as opposed to our appropriate carrying out of economy.
Right.
Like in spite of us, God is economizing these wonderful, loving, grace-filled men and women.
Yeah, and the fact that God can fill up that which is lacking doesn't mean that we should be slack and not worry about it.
I mean, St. Cyprian said exactly that. He said, don't continue. You recognize it's an error. Don't continue in the error. And so, do you agree with St. Justin? There is no contradiction between being a philosopher and a Christian. And Father George, I guess Metalinos, Father George Metalinos, that Christianity is a spiritual continuation of Hellenism in almost everything. Well, this is way off topic, but if you want to answer it, go for it.
Well, I would say that if you understand Hellenism as being a philosophical tradition that the church took and was able to use, you could say it's a continuation, but it's certainly not just taking Greek philosophy as it was prior to the gospel and saying that they were already on the same page. Basically,
Right.
what Saint Basil the Great said about Greek learning was that just as you could make medicines out of poisonous snakes, you can take Greek learning and you can derive great benefit from it. So there's a lot in Greek philosophy that you could say anticipates the gospel, and that in God's providence, that some groundwork was laid, but the church certainly took what it wanted out of Greek philosophy and it spat out the bones that it didn't want out of Greek philosophy, and it redefined a lot of Greek philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting that the fathers did not sit at the feet of the philosophers. They used the terminology and the meanings that were given to speak to the generation that they were preaching to and evangelizing. And they're very critical of Plato and other philosophers. And the other thing people need to remember is that Saint Basil later visited Palestine, and he praised the monks, and he said, "This is the true life." And he kind of was critical of his own time in Athens. Like, well, that's nothing compared to what I discovered here among the ascetics. People forget that part 2 of Basil's life. He becomes a monastic, an ascetic. He writes a rule, and that's really where he then matures spiritually. So yes, we can use all that, but we shouldn't identify that as somehow a formation in Christ.
I would say that you already see this process of making use of Greek philosophy, but using it in a Christian way in the New Testament itself, especially in the Epistle to the Hebrews, but elsewhere as well, like St. John's Gospel. So it's not something that happened later, like Protestants would want to say some pagan corruption of Christianity, but it was Christianity using ideas and terminology that was there to convey the faith, but they were redefining much of the terminology, and they were changing the philosophy that was already out there to make it conform to Christianity and not the other way around.
What saints, councils, and fathers taught that, quote, chrismation fills that which is lacking?
Well, St. Augustine, talking about the military mark, that's exactly what he says, is basically baptism is like a form. It's just like if you have somebody who's a LARPer and he's running around in a Marine dress blue uniform, but he's not actually in the Marine Corps, you can say, you're a phony. That uniform doesn't mean anything on you. But if that guy later on sees the light and he joins the Marine Corps and he goes through boot camp and now he has a right to wear that uniform, he doesn't have to buy a new uniform, is basically what St. Augustine was trying to say. And so that which was lacking is filled in by the proper relationship with what the form is pointing to. And so if you're actually a Marine dress blue uniform means something. But if you're not in the Marine Corps, you just went to the Army Navy surplus and bought something and you're wearing it, but it doesn't mean anything with you wearing it.
So what's lacking is the grace of the Holy Spirit, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So
and,
the form
and a proper relationship with the organization that your outward form is presenting you as belonging to.
So the implication is not the form is lacking, the spirit is lacking. The form is presumed,
right,
and the spirit is lacking. That's important, because some people think, well, economia can just magically make up everything. No. What we're talking about is that they don't have the Spirit of God outside the church. That's what they're lacking, and that's everything. That's everything. That's the life in Christ. So, but let's go on, because we only got a few more minutes and we got a bunch of questions. With Saint Stephen and Saint Cyprian, it is important to note that Saint Stephen has been glorified primarily for his martyrdom, while Saint Cyprian has been glorified also for his proclamation of ecclesiology. Okay, thank you.
And we don't have any canons from Pope Saint Stephen that are ecumenical canons, but we do have Saint Cyprian's canon.
That's right. It is interesting that all of the this is Anon, I don't know. It's interesting that all of the monastic and spiritual flourishing in the world has resulted from saints who insisted that all heterodox need to be baptized Orthodox, from Saint Nicodemus. I'm sorry, I got cut off. Among the Greeks to Saint Paisius for the Slavs. That's his point. Okay, thank you. Athos is, in other words, the source of much regeneration, at least for the last couple hundred years, for sure.
Right.
This is too long to post. Some people are saying that Saint Cyprian's canon has been abrogated. Where are they getting this information from? Do you think that
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You answer that, and then I'll put the second part here.
Okay, so basically the problem with that is there was no reason for the second canon of the Council of Trullo to mention his canon if it was already null and void. They didn't need to mention it. There was no compelling reason for them to mention it. As a matter of fact, if they were of the opinion that that council was totally wrong, they might have needed to issue a canon that said St. Cyprian's council was off on this issue, and so pay no attention to him. But the fact that they affirmed him means that they thought that it was eternally true in some sense. And you have to say that it was eternally true in the sense that it means that there are no grace-filled baptisms outside of the church.
Yeah, it's as if the implication would be, well, they're just taking the canon and putting it among all the canons, but they're not considering it as they do all the other canons. And in the Council of Trullo, they say this is for the healing and the restoration. Must follow these canons. We must be, so why would they put it and then say that about all the canons, and then mentally they think it's just.
There are many councils that they could have mentioned if they were just trying to give you a complete list of all the councils that had ever been held.
Yeah, they didn't mention Arles. Arles was not mentioned, and that was important in the West. Nobody. The last word here is chrismation. Do you think that overuse of or inappropriate use of economia is due to ignorance or from exposure to ecumenism, or for some it is a less arduous option in busier parishes just to receive through, in other words, practical reasons to receive through chrismation? What's the reason for the overuse or inappropriate use of economia?
I think there could be many reasons why it happens. I think in some cases there is a naivete about Protestants. I heard an Orthodox priest on a podcast several years ago who was asked the question, what do you do if you're in an area where there's no Orthodox church around? And he said, well, I think that it'd be okay to go to the local, Protestant church, because at least you'd hear the liturgy of the word. Well, the thing is, no, you would not. And I think that, this was a priest who was a cradle Orthodox priest. I think he probably just had a very bad misconception about what happens on Sunday morning in a Protestant church. But I also, in an article I wrote on this subject, pointed out that you had the new martyr Lydia of Russia, whose father was a priest who joined the Living Church. And there you actually could say you had the liturgy of the word at a Living Church parish, because they, for the most part, did keep the outward forms of Orthodox liturgies. And she refused to go to her own father's parish because he belonged to the Living Church. And so that would be a lot closer call there. And she said the answer was no. So I think it'd be totally foolish. But I think that if you grow up in the church, you can assume a lot about Protestantism. But for those of us who've been in it, we just know that it's nothing like what you think. It ain't anything like the liturgy of the word.
Another question is, would Father Peter or Father John rebaptize? That is, I guess rebaptize might be the case. Depends on what they're doing. An Uniate Catholic or schismatical calendars who basically have the same form and many faith points in common.
Well, in the case of a Uniate, you would at least have a good argument for receiving them by chrismation. But it would depend, and I would have to ask my bishop about it. It would also depend on whether they wanted to be received by baptism. To me, I mean, if it was a stumbling block for them to be received by baptism, I would talk to the bishop about it. But when you talk about an old calendarist, I would think that they were probably baptized by the right form. And so unless they were begging to be baptized, I would probably say let's receive them by profession of faith and renunciation of errors. But I always talk to my bishop about that. The default in the Russian Church abroad is we baptize everybody unless we get the bishop's permission to do something different. So in any case, where I would do anything other than baptize somebody, I have to talk to my bishop and find out what he wants me to do.
That's the exact opposite of most places, right?
Yeah.
They chrismate as a rule, and they have to get a blessing to baptize. So that's the church abroad in that sense is trying, I think, following in large measure the tradition of the church throughout the ages. But it's interesting that, and this is something we're working on at Uncle Mountain Press, that St. Paisios Veloskovsky. Let me just say goodbye, everybody over at Orthodox Ethos, because unfortunately there's a 3-hour limit there, and they're going to be automatically kicked off over at Orthodox Ethos, our website. So if you're there and you want to come over to YouTube or Patreon or wherever we're streaming to Twitter and Facebook. So St. Paisios Veloskovsky baptized Uniates in his day, and he was very strident in that, which is interesting because I think what they were fighting against at the time, I'm trying to understand historically the context, is the beginning of what we're living in full now, is this erosion of the consciousness of the need for triple immersion. And even though, and he also was an ardent polemicist against the Uniates, who were very, problematic in his day and they were fairly new, I guess, in some parts of that part of the world. But he was the spiritual father of Dorotheos Voulesmas, who was the one appointed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate to review and to basically sign off on behalf of the Patriarchate the rudder, the pedalion, and he was a spiritual son of St. Paisios Veloskovsky. Some people have come aligned him as being some, just kind of not that important, and that he ended up changing things in the pedalion. It's couldn't be farther from the truth. We're trying to get to the point where we're going to translate his work, Dorotheos Voulesmas' work, which is a treatise on why Latins must be baptized, and basically support. It's a complement to the pedalion and Saint Nicodemus. And I'd really like to see actually a biography written of Voulesmas, because he's very important in that whole time period in the 18th century for what the Patriarchate ended up doing.
I could be remembering incorrectly, but I think that the canonical church in Ukraine baptizes people who were baptized in the schismatic church in Ukraine. And it's not because the form would be unacceptable. It's because they want to make the point that don't be confused that these people are okay. And it's a point that needs to be made there.
Which drives home the point St. Basil says, that whether there's economy elsewhere, he insists on akrivia, and there's no contradiction there. Whereas most people would be aghast. Like, how can you? In fact, you remember the Anglican in the 1850s, he went to the Russians and they wanted to chrismate. He went to the Greeks, he wanted to baptize. Right. Famous, forget his name right now, William Palmer. Yeah. And he was aghast, like, what's going on here? Well, actually, it's right there in St. Basil, right? He says, there's an economy in Rome, but I insist on baptism. I think that breaks the rationalism of most people. Like, they can't figure that out, and that's good. Paisios asked, is there any example of a clairvoyant, miracle-working saint who was received in the church post-schism by chrismation? A clairvoyant, miracle-working saint. I don't think so. I've never heard anything like that.
I don't know, but it'd be an interesting subject to really dig into, because it wouldn't surprise me if there was, some uniate or former uniate who had been received into the church by some form of economia that wound up becoming a saint. But I can't say that I can point you to one right off the top of my head.
The person who asked about ecclesial supplet, let me get this off the screen, is clarifying that it is a principle in Catholic canon law that allows the church to provide graces in certain circumstances, even if the baptism did not include the words Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This
Yeah,
means
we
that the
don't.
church supplies graces if something is not quite right without the individual's fault. We don't have anything like that.
We don't have anything quite like that. Which is, you might remember recently there was a Roman Catholic priest who had been baptizing people by saying, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." And the Vatican, to my surprise, declared all of those baptisms to be invalid, and told that priest that he was not supposed to have done that. And you would think that you could say, well, don't do that again, but we'll say by economia that all those baptisms were valid. But they tracked down all those people and made them get rebaptized, and some of those people had been communicating the Roman Catholic Church for many years. So that was a surprising example of them being strict.
Another question. Canon 95 of Trullo says that Nestorians are to be received via renunciation and confession. Nestorians still normatively baptized with triple immersion and in the name of the Holy Trinity. In this case, would the strictness of reception by renunciation and confession and the economy be via baptism? That's not. I don't. That question isn't making sense to me. Would the strictness of reception be renunciation and confession, and the economy? Oh, I see. No economy. Here's my understanding. Father John, chime in if you think this is not accurate, but this is how we should understand. Somebody asked about the 95 canon, and they imply that it becomes the rule they should be received by economy. But the ecclesia is the gospel, right? The exactitude is the gospel. It's not another canon or practice. It's the gospel. So it can never be the ecclesia can never become the departure from the gospel, or the economy the exception, right? You're not going to make the thief on the cross the norm. You're going to make the gospels, the teaching of the Lord is the norm, or the exactitude, right? So even if it's a canon of ecumenical council, it's still in the realm of economy. And in the canon itself, it says all others should be baptized. These particular ones should be received by chrismation, these by baptism, and all other heresies by baptism. So they even point you in the very canon to the exactitude, which is always going to be baptism. So you can't. Does that make sense, Father?
Well, you certainly have a strong case that when you have a canon that says Nestorians should be received by profession of faith or renunciation of errors, that's something that would be allowable. I think the key question you'd have to ask is, do they really baptize by triple immersion at this point or not? And I really don't know the answer to that question, but it wouldn't surprise me if they've gotten lax on it. And I would also say, in along the lines of what you were just saying, that if the bishop said, no, we're going to receive them by chrismation, or no, we're going to baptize them, that the bishop would have every right to do that.
And I would also add that in our book, and we make, I think, a good case, but you have to read it and see that this canon of 95 is largely misunderstood in the light of several other things. One of them being, it's misunderstood that is actually what it's saying. He's saying historians, Trullo says that they were received by renunciation and confession. We make the case that that's not actually the case, that the proper understanding of the canon is not that they should be received, but they should be that when you read the canon properly, and we've given an analysis of that. We're following a scholar in England who's making this case, and we follow that because of other subsequent events in church history. But the canon itself could be read very easily for them to be attached to the last group, which is by baptism. And I can't explain all the argument for it. It's in the book, but what's interesting is historically we have, for instance, the council in Georgia about 400 years later, where they are talking about the Monophysites, which is the same grouping that Canon 95 puts the Nestorians, and they're saying we baptize them. And they don't just say we baptize them, but following the practice in Antioch and the Patriarchates of the East, we baptize. So that's very strange. If they were interpreting, and the general interpretation at that time was that canon was calling for people to be received by renunciation or confession, well, the Church of Georgia didn't get the memo, and they're saying that the rest of the churches in the East were baptizing them. So I think there's a case to be made that this canon is not read properly. There's There's various manuscripts that come down. Anyway, I can't make the case, reproduce the case right now, but it's very interesting for those who have the book. They ought to go and examine that. Father Patrick, his last name, I just forgot his last name. Father Patrick Ramsey. Ramsey. Father Patrick Ramsey has a piece on this in his academia page.
Okay.
For people who want to go into that. I think we're going to end it here pretty quick here. We're way over the normal time that I do these things. So let me try. We got two more. Father Bless, assuming the form is there, everything is perfect for with the baptism and is done by a Protestant, is the church forced to receive them by chrismation? I think we've already answered this, but go ahead, Father.
No.
Yeah, the answer is no. The church is never forced to do that. We talked about this earlier. And St. Basil's Canon 47 is a great example that, he didn't do that. He didn't think that was the case. What would be the problem if someone wants a corrective baptism and they go against their priest and bishop? If not blessed, no grace? Is that the outcome? That they're not going to have the grace if they insist on a corrective baptism? That's somebody's question.
Well, St. Ignatius of Antioch, a disciple of the Apostle John, said, "Do nothing without the bishop." And so that's what I would say. If your bishop's a heretic, you need to find another bishop. But I think that's what we should go by. I think in Manathos, it's a little bit different because I do think that the authority of an abbot, it puts it in a little bit different category. But you should do it.
If you're, forgive me, Father John, if your bishop was teaching ecumenism and he was basing his policy of reception on the fact that he believed there was grace in the mysteries,
I would find another bishop in that case. But I wouldn't just do something willy-nilly without a bishop's authority, because I think that you get into dangerous territory when you start doing stuff on your own without that kind of spiritual protection. I've a few times in my Orthodox life regretted not getting a blessing for something, but I've never regretted getting a blessing. It's always better to have a blessing than to not have a blessing.
Yeah, you remind me of well, no, it's all right. It's a joke. I won't say it, but unfortunately, we're in the realm, Father, of increasingly the humanistic vision of the church, which is justifying economy as a rule, is increasingly, as we see with these decisions, these agreements, these pronouncements. So more and more people are finding themselves denied baptism on the basis of not some economy or even some plausible economy, but just on the basis of we cannot baptize.
We're in those cases, if you have a bishop that says you cannot be baptized because the baptisms of the heterodox are grace-filled, then I think you have every right to go find another bishop, because that's a bishop that's proclaiming heresy publicly. And the canons say that you don't have to remain under such a bishop.
Right. This is a very important point, but we won't get into it now. But the whole question of obedience and the presuppositions for obedience, I mean, unfortunately, this is going to be increasingly a problem for some people. And it's really hard to navigate. It takes a lot of humility and caution, and yet it's definitely a part of the holy tradition, because we have saints who we sing their praises every year, many times throughout the year, who resisted heretical bishops and did not follow them. In fact, we resisted them to their face, and St. Cyril resisting Nestorius, and on and on and on. So it is, I think it drives home the fact that we're all co-responsible for the church. You need to know your faith. You have to know your faith. What does it mean when you confess, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? That's a confession of faith. It's not a description. It's not, I acknowledge that there's a church. I believe in it. And so that's a matter of faith. It's an article of faith. And if somebody departs from that, the hierarchy of obedience is broken, right? We're obedient to the priest, who's obedient to the bishop, who's obedient to Christ. And therefore it's all salvific. But if you have somebody who in this chain who departs, and is preaching another Christ, another church, then you're no longer being obedient to Christ when that person departs from, right? Isn't that
right?
I think that's how it works. Thank you so much, Father, for joining us. Thank you for enduring these 3 hours. I can't believe it's been 3 hours. This is a vastly important topic today. It's there, as you can see, there's a lot of rabbit holes, trails rather, and so we need to have this discussion. We're not always going to see totally eye to eye, but that's part of the process, I think, of reaching the patristic consensus today. Because look, we're all in the midst of this milieu, which is chaos, right? The world is chaos. There's so much pressure for us to depart from the narrow path. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting the faithful to tread that narrow path. And thank you for your review and your support of the book. And may it help many by your prayers. And good struggles. Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. We'll see you for all of you who are on Orthodox Ethos on Patreon. And you're going to be joining us. We'll be back tomorrow night, Thursday, for our regular question and answer session, and next Tuesday for the next live stream. Thank you so much for joining us, and God bless.
Extubri mataris